before the eagles of Rome cast their long shadow, before the legions marched and history was written in blood and stone, there was a land of mist and magic, of deep woods and winding rivers. This was Gaul. Forget for a moment the battlefields and the conquests. Let's journey back to a time when this vast expanse, stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, breathed a different kind of life, a wilder, freer existence. Imagine a world draped in green, immense, ancient forests, so dense the sunlight struggled to touch the mossy ground. These were not just trees, they were the heart of Gaul, the realm of the stag and the wild boar, the sanctuary of gods and spirits. Through these woods, crystal-clear rivers carved their paths to the sea, arteries of life for the people who lived along their banks. This was a land of rolling hills, fertile plains, and rugged mountains, a mosaic of landscapes that shaped the soul of its inhabitants. And who were these people? We call them the Gauls. A collection of Celtic tribes, fierce and proud, yet deeply connected to the world around them. They were not a single unified nation, as we might think of one today, but a rich tapestry of clans and communities, each with its own chief, its own traditions, its own patch of this green earth to call home. Names like the Arverni, the Aedui, the Helvetii, and the Belgi were spoken with reverence and loyalty. They were rivals at times, allies at others, their relationships as shifting as the seasons. Picture a Gallic settlement, a village known as an oppidum. Often built on a hill for defense, it was a bustling hub of life, protected by sturdy walls of timber and earth. Inside, you wouldn't find grand stone palaces, but roundhouses with thatched roofs, their walls made of wattle and daub. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke from the central hearth, the sound of children's laughter, and the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Fortigals were master craftsmen. Their smiths were legendary, forging intricate jewelry of gold and bronze, and crafting weapons of such high quality that even the Romans would later admire and adopt their designs, particularly their life revolved around the seasons and the soil. Farmers would guide their plows, pulled by oxen through the fields, cultivating wheat and barley. They were skilled pastoralists, their wealth often measured in the size of their herds of cattle and sheep. In the evenings, families would gather around the fire. It was a time for storytelling, for passing down the epic tales of heroes and gods, a history not written in books, but spoken on the wind, carried in the memory of the tribe. Bards, held in high esteem, would pluck at the strings of a lyre, their powerful voices weaving sagas that connected the present generation to their ancestors. Spirituality was woven into the very fabric of their existence. The Gauls saw divinity everywhere. In the gurgling spring, the ancient oak tree, the misty mountain top, their priests, the druids, were more than just religious leaders. They were the judges, the teachers, the healers, and the astronomers of their society. They held immense power and respect, studying the stars, presiding over rituals in sacred groves, and memorizing vast amounts of sacred knowledge, which they believed was too powerful to be written down. They taught of the soul's immortality, its journey from one life to the next, a belief that perhaps explains the Gauls' renowned bravery in the face of death. Their society was structured, though not as rigidly as Rome's. At the top were the nobles and warriors, their status displayed in the finely crafted torques around their necks and the quality of their horses and chariots. Below them were the common people, the farmers and artisans who formed the backbone of the tribe, and at the bottom were those who had fallen into debt or been captured in intertribal skirmishes. It was a society built on loyalty, honor, and a fierce love of freedom. The Gauls were a people of passion and contradiction. They loved feasting and drinking, hosting great banquets where boasts were made and heroic poems were sung. They were famously hospitable, yet quick to anger and fiercely protective of their honor. Roman writers often describe them as tall and fair-skinned, with bright, challenging eyes, their hair lightened with lime to a fiery blonde and swept back from their foreheads like a horse's mane. They were warriors, yes, but they were also poets, farmers, and artists. This was the world of Gaul before Caesar, a land of hundreds of tribes, each with its own vibrant culture, a world governed by the cycles of nature and the wisdom of the druids. It was a place of deep roots, of communities bound by kinship, and a shared sense of identity. An identity tied inextricably to the forests, rivers, and hills they called home. It was a tranquil land, in its own way. A dynamic, sometimes volatile, but ultimately balanced world. But this balance was fragile. Across the mountains, a new power was rising. An empire with an insatiable appetite for expansion. A storm was gathering, and the tranquil green world of the Gauls was unknowingly standing on the edge of a cataclysm that would change it, and the course of history, forever. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this glimpse into ancient Gaul as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, and the next chapter is just around the corner. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our journey through the annals of history. Today, we step into a world of clashing steel, towering ambitions, and a fight for survival. This is Chapter 2, The Shadow of Rome. The year's 58 BC, the Roman Republic, a sprawling and insatiable power, casts its gaze northward, towards a land the Romans called Gaul, a patchwork of hundreds of fiercely independent tribes. Gaul was a land of dense forests, untamed rivers, and proud warriors. But to Rome, it was a land of opportunity, resources, and glory. And the man who would seize that opportunity was none other than Gaius Julius Caesar. A brilliant general, a cunning politician, and a writer of no small talent, Caesar arrived in Gaul, not just as a governor, but as an architect of empire. He needed a military victory to bolster his political career back in Rome, and Gaul was the perfect stage. But what did this mean for the Gallic people? For tribes like the Helvetia, the Aedui, the Arverni, they were caught in an impossible position. On one side stood the might of the Roman legions, a professional war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. On the other, the constant threat of rival tribes and migrating Germanic peoples from across the Rhine. To understand Rome's hunger for conquest, you have to understand the Republic itself. Rome was a society built on expansion. Military success brought wealth in the form of slaves, gold, and land. It brought prestige and political power to generals like Caesar. The legions weren't just a defense force. They were the engine of the Roman economy and the primary vehicle for political advancement. Conquest was not just a policy. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman identity. Caesar's initial pretext for intervention was seemingly noble: to defend Gallic allies, the Aedui, from the migrating Helvetii. But this act of defense was the key that unlocked the door to all of Gaul. Caesar masterfully exploited the internal divisions among the Gallic tribes. He would ally with one tribe to defeat another, then turn on his former allies when it suited him. He presented himself as a protector, a mediator, a bringer of Roman order, all while systematically dismantling Gallic independence. The Gauls were not a unified people. They were a collection of rival chiefdoms and confederations, often at war with one another. This disunity was their greatest weakness, and Caesar's greatest strength. He could pick them off one by one, using their own rivalries against them. Some tribes, seeing the writing on the wall, chose to ally with Rome, hoping for preferential treatment. They became friends of the Roman people, a status that offered protection but demanded submission. Others resisted, fighting with incredible courage for their freedom, their homes, and their way of life. The campaigns were brutal. Caesar's own account, the Gallic Wars, details sieges of fortified towns. Oropita pitched battles against massive Gallic armies and ruthless campaigns of suppression. We read of entire populations sold into slavery, of scorched earth tactics designed to starve a resisting tribe into submission. The scale of the conflict was immense, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. Think of it from a Gallic perspective. Imagine seeing the disciplined lines of the Roman legions marching into your lands. Their armor gleams in the sun, their standards the famous eagles held high. They build fortified camps in a matter of hours, construct siege engines that can smash through your strongest walls, and fight with a coordination that seems almost supernatural. This wasn't just a battle against another tribe. This was a confrontation with a different kind of power, a relentless, organized force of conquest. The choice for a Gallic chieftain was agonizing. Do you fight and risk the complete annihilation of your people? Or do you submit, pay tribute, send your own sons to serve in the Roman army, and watch as your culture is slowly eroded by Roman influence? There was no easy answer. Independence meant constant warfare and uncertainty. Submission meant a loss of freedom but a chance at survival, perhaps even prosperity. Under the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, for 8 long years, Caesar waged his war across Gaul. From the forests of Belgium to the shores of the Atlantic, he fought, he negotiated, he conquered, even launched expeditions to Britain and across the Rhine into Germania, demonstrating the terrifying reach of Roman power. These were not just military campaigns. They were a demographic and cultural cataclysm for Gaul. It's estimated that 1 million Gauls may have died, and another 1 million were enslaved. But the spirit of Gallic resistance was not yet broken. As Caesar's campaigns wore on, the tribes began to realize that Roman promises of friendship were hollow. They saw that Caesar's true goal was not protection, but total subjugation. The scattered embers of resistance were about to be fanned into a great fire, a final, desperate struggle for a free Gaul. A leader would emerge, a man capable of uniting the warring tribes against their common enemy. But that is a story for our next chapter. The shadow of Rome had fallen across Gaul, and its length would stretch for centuries. Caesar's conquest was a pivotal moment in history. It secured Rome's northern frontier, provided Caesar with the wealth and loyal army he needed to seize power in Rome, and ultimately transformed the Gallic lands into a Roman province that would be a cornerstone of the future empire. The clash between Roman ambition and Gallic independence was a crucible that forged a new future for Western Europe. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Caesar's Gallic Wars. The story of these tribes, caught between a rock and a hard place, is a powerful reminder of the human cost of empire. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters from history's epic saga. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll witness the rise of a Gallic hero who dared to challenge Caesar himself. See you next time. In the heart of ancient Gaul, amidst the rolling hills and dense forests of what is now central France, a legend was born. Long before the banners of Rome cast their long shadow over these lands, a boy was born into the powerful Arverni tribe, a boy destined to unite a people and challenge an empire. His name was Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was no ordinary child. He was the son of Celtic, the chieftain of the Arverni, one of the most influential and respected leaders in all of Gaul. From his earliest days, he was surrounded by the trappings of power and the weight of expectation. His father's hall buzzed with the talk of tribal politics, alliances, and the ever-present, ever-expanding threat from the south. Rome, young Vercingetorix would sit, listen, and learn, his sharp mind absorbing every detail. He saw how his father commanded respect not just through strength, but through wisdom and charisma. His education was a tapestry woven from the threads of Gallic tradition. He wasn't just taught in a formal sense. He learned by doing, by living. He spent his days in the saddle, mastering the art of horsemanship until the horse felt like an extension of his own body. He trained with the sword, the shield, and the spear alongside the sons of other nobles, his natural talent and fierce determination quickly setting him apart. He wasn't just learning to fight. He was learning to lead warriors, to inspire them to follow him into the heart of the fray. But a chieftain's strength isn't only measured on the battlefield. The druids, the wise priests, philosophers, and judges of Gallic society took a keen interest in the promising young noble. They were the keepers of history, law, and the sacred mysteries. Under their tutelage, Vercingetorix learned the epic poems of his ancestors, tales of heroic deeds and divine struggles. He learned the intricate laws that governed the tribes and the complex web of relationships that held Gallic society together. The Druids taught him about the cycles of nature, the will of the gods, and the importance of unity. They instilled in him a profound love for his land and a deep, spiritual connection to his people's identity. This spiritual grounding would become the bedrock of his convictions. His upbringing was a delicate balance between the warrior's path and the statesman's mind. He would spend one day sparring with seasoned veterans, learning tactics and strategy, and the next day he would sit in council, observing the subtle art of diplomacy and negotiation. He saw firsthand the fierce independence of the Gallic tribes, their pride, and their rivalries. He understood that these divisions, which had kept them strong in their own territories, were also their greatest weakness against a unified enemy like Rome. Tragedy struck early in his life, shaping his destiny in a way he could never have imagined. His father, Celtic, in his ambition to unite the tribes under his sole rule, was accused of aspiring to be a king, an idea that many freedom-loving Gallic nobles deeply resented. He was ultimately executed by his own people for his ambition. This devastating event left a permanent mark on Viet. He witnessed the dangers of disunity and the fatal consequences of personal ambition, clashing with tribal pride. It was a harsh, brutal lesson in Gallic politics. He learned that, to lead the Gauls, you couldn't simply demand loyalty. You had to earn it. You couldn't be a king who ruled over them, but a chieftain who fought alongside them. After his father's death, Vercingetorix was in a precarious position. The title of chieftain did not automatically pass to him. Instead, his uncle, Gobanicio, took control of the Arverni leadership, favoring a policy of appeasement and cooperation with the increasingly powerful Romans. Vercingetorix, now a young man forged in the fires of tradition and personal loss, watched with a growing sense of frustration and anger. He saw Roman influence creeping into his homeland, Roman merchants and officials becoming a common sight, and the proud Gallic way of life slowly eroding. During these formative years, he cultivated friendships with other young nobles from various tribes. These weren't just casual acquaintances. They were strategic alliances built on shared ideals and a common resentment of Roman encroachment. He listened to their grievances, shared their frustrations, and began to plant the seeds of a radical idea: a united Gaul. He spoke of a land free from foreign domination, a land where Gauls would determine their own destiny. His charisma honed, since childhood, drew others to him. They saw in him the strength of his father, but also a wisdom and caution born from tragedy. They saw a leader, the teachings of the Druids, the martial skill of a warrior, the political acumen learned in his father's hall, and the painful sting of loss all combined to forge an extraordinary character. It was prude, but not arrogant. He was ambitious, but for his people, not just for himself. He possessed a burning passion for Gallic freedom, a passion that would soon ignite a firestorm across the entire continent. The boy born in the heart of the Arverni lands was no longer just the son of a fallen chieftain. He was becoming a symbol of hope, a rallying cry for the oppressed. The stage was set. The players were in position, and Vercingetorix was ready to step into the light of history, not just as a chieftain of the Arverni, but as the future chieftain of all Gauls. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you're fascinated by the stories of legendary leaders, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter, where Vercingetorix's rebellion finally begins. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the life of Julius Caesar. We're now entering a pivotal phase: his conquest of Gaul. This wasn't just a series of battles. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering, military genius, and ruthless ambition that would forever change the course of Rome and Europe. In 58 BC, Caesar was appointed governor of 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. To an ordinary politician, this was a comfortable, lucrative post. To Caesar, it was a launchpad. He saw Gaul, a vast territory inhabited by hundreds of fiercely independent tribes, not just as a threat to be managed, but as an opportunity to build a personal army, immense wealth, and a legendary reputation that would eclipse all his rivals back in Rome. His first major test came almost immediately with the migration of the Helvetii, a massive tribe seeking new lands. They wanted to pass through Roman territory, but Caesar saw this as a direct challenge to Roman authority and, more importantly, a perfect excuse to begin his military operations. He didn't just block their path. He pursued them, engaged them, and ultimately crushed them near the town of Bib. This victory sent a clear message to all of Gaul. Rome, under Caesar, was not to be trifled with. He then swiftly turned his attention to a Germanic king, Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine and was unsettling the region. By defeating Ariovistus, Caesar positioned himself not just as a conqueror, but as the protector of the Gallic tribes against foreign invaders. It was a brilliant piece of political theater. Back in Rome, the political scene was a viper's nest. The first triumvirate, the fragile alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, was the only thing keeping the Republic from tearing itself apart. Pompey, the celebrated general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, watched Caesar's Gallic exploits with a mixture of admiration and growing anxiety. Caesar was becoming too popular, too powerful. Every victory he reported back to the Senate detailed in his famous Commentaries on the Gallic War was a carefully crafted piece of propaganda, designed to bolster his image with the Roman people while reminding his political rivals of his growing military might. The Senate was divided. Some, like Cicero, were wary of Caesar's ambition, while others, like the populist Clodius Pulcher, were his allies, causing chaos in the streets of Rome to keep his enemies off balance. Caesar's strategy and goal was a potent mix of divide and conquer and overwhelming force. He was a master of diplomacy, forging alliances with certain tribes. By offering them protection, trade benefits, and Roman favor, he would support one tribe against another, inserting himself into their aduled conflicts and making himself the indispensable arbiter of Gallic affairs. The Aedui, for example, became key Roman allies, providing Caesar with supplies and intelligence. But for those who resisted, Caesar's response was swift and brutal. His legions, arguably the most effective fighting force the world had ever seen, were disciplined, well-equipped, and fanatically loyal to their general. He shared their hardships, knew his centurions by name, and led from the front, inspiring a devotion that money couldn't buy. One of Caesar's most audacious moves was his invasion of Britain in 55 BC. From a purely strategic standpoint, it was a sideshow. The island was mysterious, its resources unknown. But Caesar understood the power of spectacle. Crossing the channel and setting foot on that mythical island was a feat that captured the imagination of the Roman public. It was a PR stunt of epic proportions, portraying him as a leader who pushed the boundaries of the known world for the glory of Rome. He didn't conquer Britain, but he didn't need to. The headlines and the prestige were conquests enough. Similarly, his bridging of the Rhine River, a remarkable feat of engineering accomplished in just 10 days, was a show of force meant to intimidate the Germanic tribes, proving that no natural barrier could stop the Roman legions. But as Caesar's legions marched from one end of Gaul to the other, a deep and bitter resentment was taking root. The Gauls were a proud people who valued their freedom above all else. Tribe after tribe had been forced to submit, provide hostages, and pay tribute. Their warriors were killed, their lands were occupied, and their way of life was being systematically dismantled. The protection Caesar offered often felt more like subjugation. The initial awe of Roman power was curdling into a shared hatred. Whispers of rebellion grew louder in the halls of chieftains and around campfires. The seeds of a massive, unified revolt were being sown, waiting for a leader charismatic and daring enough to unite the disparate tribes against their common enemy. This simmering rage was about to boil over. While Caesar was busy managing political fires in Rome and consolidating his gains, the Gauls were preparing for a final, desperate struggle to reclaim their freedom. The greatest challenge of Caesar's Gallic campaign was yet to come. A young, noble chieftain from the Arverni tribe was about to step onto the stage of history and unite the Gauls in a way no one thought possible. His name was Vercingetorix, and his rebellion would push Caesar and his legions to the very brink of disaster. The conquest of Gaul was far from over. Its bloodiest and most decisive chapter was about to begin. Join us next time as we dive into the Great Gallic Revolt, the epic confrontation between Caesar and Vercingetorix, and the dramatic siege of Alesia that would finally decide the fate of Gaul. It's a story of courage, betrayal, and a clash of civilizations you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and if you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. See you then. Welcome back to our journey through the history of Gaul. Last time, we saw the final battles that brought this vast land under the eagle of Rome. But victory on the battlefield is one thing. Winning the peace is another entirely. Today, in Chapter 5, we delve into the simmering cauldron of resentment that was Roman Gaul, exploring seeds of rebellion. Imagine your home, your land, suddenly no longer your own. For the Gauls, the arrival of Roman legions wasn't just a change of leadership, it was a fundamental shift in their way of life. The initial shock of conquest soon gave way to the harsh reality of occupation. The air, once filled with the sounds of tribal councils and the songs of druids, now echoed with the clank of legionary sandals and the authoritative commands of Roman officials. The first and most biting sting was economic. Rome, an empire built on conquest, was also an empire funded by it. The Gauls, a proud and once prosperous people, were now burdened with crushing taxes. It wasn't just a portion of their harvest or a few coins from their trade. It was a systematic extraction of wealth. Roman tax collectors, the infamous publicani descended upon the provinci. They were not salaried officials but private contractors who bid for the right to collect taxes. Their profit came from whatever they could squeeze out of the populace above the amount owed to Rome. This system was ripe for corruption and exploitation. Think of a Gallic farmer. He tills the same land his ancestors did, but now a significant portion of his grain, his livestock, his very livelihood, is carted away to feed a distant city and its armies. Failure to pay meant crippling debt, and debt often led to the loss of land or, even worse, bondage. This wasn't just an economic transaction. It was a daily humiliation, a constant reminder that they were a conquered people, their labor fueling the very machine that held them in chains. The wealth of Gaul was being siphoned off, flowing south across the Alps to build the marble temples and opulent villas of Rome, while many Gauls struggled to feed their own families. Beyond the economic strain was a profound loss of freedom, a spiritual and cultural suffocation. The Romans were master administrators, and they brought their laws, their language, and their gods. The intricate web of Gallic tribal society, with its own complex laws, customs, and political structures, was dismantled or forcibly reshaped to fit the Roman model. The proud chieftains, who once commanded the loyalty of their warriors and the respect of their people, were now reduced to local magistrates, their authority contingent on Roman approval. They were caught in an impossible position: enforce Roman demands on their own people or face the wrath of the governor. The Druids, the spiritual and intellectual heart of Gallic society, faced an even worse fate. Rome saw them not as priests or philosophers, but as dangerous political agitators, the glue that held tribal resistance together. Their sacred groves were desecrated, their practices outlawed, and their influence systematically erased. For the average Gaul, this was a devastating blow. It was as if their connection to the gods, to their ancestors, and to the very meaning of their world was being severed. The spiritual landscape became as barren as the overtaxed fields, and so anger began to grow. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, burning fire. It smoldered in the hearts of farmers watching their harvest being taken. It sparked in the eyes of young warriors forced to serve in Roman auxiliary units, fighting for their conquerors in faraway lands. It was whispered in hushed tones around hearth fires at night, tales of the old days, of freedom, of heroes who fought the Romans. The Gauls were a warrior people. Honor, pride, and freedom were central to their identity. To be subjected, to be taxed, to have their culture suppressed was anathema to their very being. The Romans may have seen them as pacified subjects, but beneath the surface of compliance, the old tribal loyalties and the warrior spirit endured. Each new tax, each arrogant decree from a Roman official, each desecrated shrine was another log on the fire. The social atmosphere was thick with tension. In the new Roman-style towns, there was an uneasy mix of Roman colonists, opportunistic merchants, and subjugated Gauls. A Gaul walking through the forum of his own town would feel like a stranger, surrounded by Latin chatter and foreign customs. He would see the wealth of his land displayed in the mosaics of a Roman villa, a wealth he could no longer enjoy. This constant visible disparity between the conquerors and the conqueror created a deep and abiding resentment. The seeds of rebellion were being sown in fertile ground. The Gauls were not a single, unified nation, but a collection of tribes, often at odds with each other. Rome had masterfully exploited these divisions during its conquest. But now, under the shared yoke of Roman rule, a new, fragile sense of common identity began to form. An Arvernian farmer might have once viewed an Aegean as a rival, but now they both saw the Roman tax collector as a common enemy. The shared experience of oppression was beginning to forge a unity that years of independence never had. The anger was palpable. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about dignity. The Gauls were being treated as inferiors in their own homeland. Their martial pride was wounded. Their spiritual world was under attack, and their future seemed to hold nothing but servitude. It was an unsustainable situation. All that was needed was a leader, a spark to ignite the dry tinder of Gallic discontent. The Romans, in their arrogance, believed they had quenched the fire of Gallic independence. They were wrong. They had merely banked the embers, which were now glowing hotter than ever, waiting for the right wind to be fanned into a raging inferno. And that wind was coming. Join us next time as we meet the man who would unite the tribes and challenge the might of Rome itself, Vercingetorix. The seeds of rebellion are about to sprout. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel so you and miss the next chapter of this epic story. We'll see you next time. In the heart of Gaul, amidst the whispers of discontent and the heavy tread of Roman legions, a fire was kindled. A fire that would soon blaze into a beacon of rebellion. This is the story of its ignition. The moment a young chieftain dared to dream of a free Gaul. Welcome back to our series on the Gallic Wars. Today, we delve into Chapter 6. The Call of the Arverni. Our story begins in Gergovia, the capital of the Arverni, one of the most powerful tribes in Gaul. The year is 52 BC4, 6 long years. Julius Caesar's campaigns have carved a path of conquest across their lands. Roman forts dot the landscape. Roman tax collectors drain their wealth, and the pride of the Gallic warrior is trampled under the sandals of the legionary. The Gauls were a fractured people, a patchwork of rival tribes, each more concerned with its own power than with the common enemy at their gates. This disunity was Caesar's greatest weapon. He played chieftain against chieftain, tribe against tribe, a masterful game of divide and conquer. But in the shadow of Roman dominance, a new voice was rising. A young Arvernian noble named Vercingetorix. His name itself was a declaration of war, meaning great king of warriors in the Gallic tongue. Unlike the older generation of chieftains, many of whom had been cowed into submission or bribed into compliance, Vercingetorix saw the bigger picture. He saw that tribe fighting tribe only strengthened Rome's grip. He saw a future where Gallic culture, their gods, their very way of life, would be erased and replaced by Roman ways. This was a future he refused to accept. Vercingetorix was charismatic, intelligent, and possessed an iron will. He had served in the Roman auxiliary cavalry, a common practice for young Gallic nobles. This experience gave him a unique and invaluable insight. He knew the Roman army from the inside. He understood their tactics, their discipline, their strengths, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. He knew that a direct confrontation, a pitched battle against the legions in an open field, was suicide. But he also knew their Achilles' heel, their long, vulnerable supply lines. His initial attempts to rally his own people, the Arverni, were met with resistance. His uncle, Gobanicio, and other leading chieftains they feared Roman retribution. Open rebellion was a gamble with stakes too high to comprehend the complete annihilation of their people. They argued for diplomacy, for finding a way to live alongside the Romans. In a dramatic council meeting, they expelled Vercingetorix from Gergovia, branding him a reckless troublemaker. But Vercingetorix was not deterred. Cast out from the halls of power, he went to the common people, the farmers, the hunters, the artisans, the disenfranchised warriors who felt the sting of Roman occupation most acutely. He went to the countryside, to the villages and farms, speaking with a passion that ignited their spirits. He spoke not as a noble demanding allegiance, but as a fellow Gaul sharing a common grievance. His message was simple, powerful, and resonated deeply. Gaul must be one. United, we are a force that can sweep the Romans from our lands. Divided, we are merely their servants, waiting our turn to be crushed. He painted a vivid picture of a restored Gallic sovereignty, a land where they were masters of their own destiny, free from foreign rule. He appealed to their shared heritage, their warrior pride, and their deep-seated love for their land. The response was overwhelming. The common folk flocked to his banner. They saw in him not just a leader, but the embodiment of their own hopes and frustrations. His small band of followers quickly swelled into a formidable army of volunteers. With this newfound support, Vercingetorix returned to Gurgovia, not as an outcast, but as a liberator. The very chieftains who had cast him out now found themselves on the wrong side of popular opinion. They were overthrown, and Vercingetorix was proclaimed king of the Arverni, hailed as the man who would unite Gaul. His first act as leader was to send out messengers, carrying his call to arms across the length and breadth of Gaul. He sent emissaries to the Carnates, who had just massacred Roman merchants at Sun. He reached out to the Parisii, the Senones, the Pictones, the Caduri, and many others. He used a system of sworn oaths and hostage exchanges, a traditional Gallic practice to bind the tribes together in a formal alliance. For the first time, a grand coalition of Gallic tribes was forming, not for a petty squabble over territory, but for a singular, monumental purpose: the expulsion of Rome. Vercingetorix was more than just a charismatic speaker. He was a brilliant organizer. He established a clear chain of command, appointing lieutenants and demanding strict discipline, a discipline that often rivaled that of the Romans themselves. He understood that passion alone would not win the war. It required strategy, coordination, and sacrifice. He levied troops from each allied tribe, demanding quotas of cavalry and infantry. He established a central command and began to formulate a daring new strategy. This strategy was brutal and scorched earth. It was a strategy born from his understanding of Roman logistics. He knew Caesar's legions were a hungry beast that needed constant feeding. The plan was to starve that beast. Vercingetorix commanded the Gauls to burn their own towns, their villages, their fields, and their granaries. Anything that could be of use to the advancing Roman army was to be destroyed. It was an agonizing policy, demanding that people destroy their own homes and livelihoods. We must sacrifice the small comforts, he argued, to win the ultimate prize of freedom. It was a testament to his leadership that so many were willing to make such a terrible sacrifice. While this was happening, Caesar was in northern Italy, completely unaware of the storm brewing in central Gaul. He believed Gaul was pacified. The news of the massacre at Cenabum and the rise of Vercingetorix soon reached him. The rebellion was spreading like wildfire, far faster and more organized than any he had faced before. Caesar knew this was different. This was not a local uprising. It was a national war for independence, led by a single, formidable commander. In the dead of winter, a time when campaigning was thought impossible, Caesar made a legendary move. He crossed the snow-covered Cevennes mountains, a feat considered impossible, to appear suddenly in the territory of the Arverni. Striking at the heart of the rebellion, this forced Vercingetorix to turn back to defend his homeland, and the great chess match between two of history's most brilliant military minds had begun. The call had been answered. The tribes were uniting. The stage was set for a bloody and decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of Gaul for centuries to come. Vercingetorix had lit the flame, and now all of Gaul was watching to see if it would be enough to burn down the Roman eagle. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the call of the Arverni. The story of Vercingetorix is just beginning, and the conflict with Caesar is about to escalate dramatically. If you enjoyed this video and want to see how this epic struggle unfolds, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep telling these incredible stories from history. We'll see you in the next one. Imagine a land fractured, a mosaic of proud, warring tribes. This was Gaul. For centuries, the Arverni, the Aedui, and countless others had fought amongst themselves, their rivalries as old as the mountains that divided their lands. To an outsider like Julius Caesar, this disunity was their greatest weakness. a vulnerability he exploited with ruthless efficiency. Roman legions marched through their lands, pitting one tribe against another, conquering them piece by piece. Gaul was bleeding, not from one great wound, but from 1,000 smaller cuts. Into this chaotic landscape steps a young chief, his eyes burning with a fire that had long been extinguished in others. Vercingetorix, of the Arverni. He saw what others refused to see, that their petty squabbles and ancient feuds were the very chains that bound them to Roman servitude. He knew that as long as they fought each other, they would never stand a chance against the disciplined might of Rome. His vision was audacious, almost unthinkable, to forge a single sword from these scattered shards of iron, to unite all of Gaul under one banner. This was a task far greater than any battlefield victory. It was a war for the hearts and minds of his own people. Vercingetorix wasn't just a warrior. He was a master of human nature. He began not with threats or force, but with words. He traveled from village to village, from one smoky longhouse to the next. He stood before councils of grim-faced elders and assemblies of eager young warriors. His voice, filled with passion and conviction, painted a vivid picture of a future free from Roman dominance. He spoke of shared ancestry, of common gods, of the sacred soil they all called home. His charisma was magnetic. He didn't just command respect. He inspired devotion. He reminded them of their shared Gallic identity, an identity that ran deeper than any tribal allegiance. He argued that the honor of the Aedui was meaningless if the Sequani were enslaved, that the strength of the Arverni was nothing if Gaul itself was broken. "Are we not all sons and daughters of this land?" he would ask, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Will we let a foreign power dictate the fate of our children? Or will we stand together as one people and reclaim our destiny?" But charisma alone wasn't enough. Vercingetorix understood the complex web of alliances and animosities. He was a shrewd diplomat. He negotiated with chieftains who had been his family's rivals for generations. He promised power and position to some, offered tributes to others, and mediated age-old disputes. He knew when to be conciliatory and when to be firm. He showed them that unity was not about surrendering their identity, but about amplifying their collective strength. He proposed a grand council, a place where all tribes would have a voice, where decisions would be made for the good of all Gaul, not just one clan. This was a radical idea. It required chieftains to swallow their pride, to set aside generations of bad blood. To convince them, Vercingetorix led by example. He was from the powerful Arverni tribe, yet he didn't demand supreme command based on his birthright. Instead, he put his own life and reputation on the line. He demonstrated his courage not just by his willingness to fight Romans, but by his willingness to trust his former enemies. He shared his strategies, listened to their counsel, and treated every chieftain, great or small, with dignity. One of his most powerful tools was the shared enemy. He focused their anger, their grief, and their fear on Rome. Every Roman atrocity, every burned village, every exorbitant tax became a rallying cry. He transformed their individual suffering into a collective cause. He created a narrative, not of an Arverni revolt or an Aedui uprising, but of a Gallic liberation. He held up the Roman eagle as the symbol of their oppression and offered a new symbol in its place, the united banner of a free Gaul. Slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. Messengers on horseback galloped across the lands, carrying not declarations of war between tribes, but pledges of allegiance to Vercingetorix's coalition. Warriors who had once met on the battlefield to kill each other now stood side by side in training camps, learning to fight as a single army. The Aedui, longtime rivals of the Arverni and allies of Rome, were a crucial piece of the puzzle. Vercingetorix worked tirelessly to win them over, appealing to their pride and showing them the hollowness of Roman promises. When the Aedui finally renounced their treaty with Caesar and joined their rebellion, it was a monumental victory, a testament to Vercingetorix's relentless diplomacy. He used powerful, symbolic acts to cement this newfound unity. He held great ceremonies where warriors from different tribes would swear oaths of loyalty not just to him, but to each other and to Gaul. He took hostages from each tribe, not as a threat, but as a promise, a living symbol of their interwoven fate. The sons of chieftains lived and trained together, forging bonds of friendship that would replace the enmities of their fathers. This was nation-building in its rawest, most urgent form, through sheer force of will, through a potent combination of soaring oratory, clever diplomacy, and unquestionable courage. Vercingetorix achieved the impossible. He took a fractured, feuding land and united it. He convinced proud, independent warriors to follow a single leader and fight for a common cause. For the first time, Gaul was not just a geographic location. It was an idea, a nation, embodied in the will of one man. This grand alliance, this united Gallic army, was his masterpiece. And it was this unprecedented unity that would finally allow them to look the Roman legions in the eye and challenge the might of Julius Caesar himself. Thank you so much for joining me on this part of the journey. The story of how this united force took on the might of Rome is coming up next, so make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss it. We'll see you in the next chapter. The winter of 52 BC was supposed to be a time of rest for Caesar's legions, a well-deserved respite after years of campaigning. But in the heart of Gaul, the embers of resentment were glowing, fanned by the winds of freedom. What began as whispers in hushed taverns and secret meetings in moonlit groves was about to erupt into a firestorm that would engulf the entire nation. This is the story of how the great Gallic rebellion was ignited. While Caesar was busy managing Roman politics in northern Italy, confident that Gaul was pacified, the seeds of defiance were taking root. The first sparks flew not in a grand battle, but in small, audacious acts of courage. In the lands of the Conaith, a tribe known for their spiritual leadership, a group of warriors, fed up with Roman arrogance and taxation, stormed the Roman trading post at Sanabum, modern-day Orleans. They fell upon the Roman merchants and the garrison commander, a swift and brutal message that Roman authority was no longer welcome. Word of this daring act spread like wildfire. Carried by riders on swift horses, the news traveled across the frozen landscape, reaching tribe after tribe. It was the signal they had all been waiting for. The spark from Sanabum landed in the fertile ground of Gallic pride, and from it, a rebellion began to bloom. All across central Gaul, villages that had once paid tribute to Rome now raised their own standards. Farmers picked up their hunting spears, blacksmiths forged swords instead of plowshares, and chieftains rallied their clans. Small Roman garrisons, isolated and scattered, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a hostile population. Supply lines were cut, foraging parties were ambushed. The Romans, who had seen themselves as masters of Gaul, were now the hunted. One after another, tribes joined the cause. The Parisii, the Senones, the Pictonisthae, all cast their lot with the rebellion. The movement needed a leader, someone to unite the disparate factions into a single, formidable force, and had found one in a young, charismatic nobleman from the Arverni tribe. His name was He was intelligent, ruthless, and possessed an unshakable belief in a free Gaul. He understood that to defeat Rome, the Gauls had to be as disciplined and unified as the legions themselves. He enforced strict military order, punishing cowardice and rewarding bravery, forging a true army from a confederation of tribes. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Caesar was completely unaware of the storm brewing. The initial reports that reached him were likely dismissed as minor local unrest, nothing his lieutenants couldn't handle. But as messenger after messenger arrived, each with a more desperate tale of escalating violence, of garrisons overrun and Roman citizens slaughtered, the true scale of the crises became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a small uprising. It was a full-blown national war. For any other general, the situation would have been catastrophic. Caesar was on the wrong side of the Alps, separated from his legions by snow-covered mountains. The rebellion was spreading, and his army was scattered across Gaul in their winter quarters, vulnerable and divided. But Caesar was not any other general. His reaction was a testament to his legendary speed and decisiveness. He didn't wait for the snow to melt. He gathered a small contingent of newly recruited cavalry and embarked on one of the most daring journeys of his career. He led his men through the treacherous passes of the Cevennes Mountains, a route considered impassable in winter. They carved a path through snowdrifts that were sometimes 10 feet deep, braving blizzards and freezing temperatures. The Gauls were stunned. They never imagined an army could cross the mountains in the dead of winter. Caesar's sudden appearance in the heart of Arverni territory, Vercingetorix's own homeland, threw the rebels into confusion. Vercingetorix was forced to turn back to defend his own people, giving Caesar the breathing room he desperately needed. Having created this crucial diversion, Caesar didn't stop. He rode day and night, with only a small guard, racing across hostile territory to reunite with his legions. It was a journey fraught with peril. Every shadow could hide an assassin, every forest an ambush. But e made Italiano. His arrival electrified his soldiers. Terry Comanda, the man who had led them to victory after victory, was back. Morale soared. Caesar quickly consolidated his forces, pulling his legions together from their scattered camps, ready to face the storm. The rebellion had been ignited, but now the true architect of Roman power had returned to the field. The stage was set for a monumental clash. On one side stood Vercingetorix, the charismatic unifier of the Gallic tribes, fighting for the freedom of his people. On the other, Julius Caesar, the brilliant and relentless Roman general, determined to hold Gaul at any cost. The greatest war of Caesar's Gallic campaigns was about to begin, a conflict that would push both men and their armies to the absolute limit. The initial sparks had grown into a raging inferno, and the fate of Gaul now hung in the balance. Thank you so much for watching. This chapter of history is filled with incredible moments of strategy and courage. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we dive into the brutal campaigns that defined this epic confrontation. See you next time. Friends, history buffs, fellow story lovers, welcome back. We've journeyed with Julius Caesar as he cut a path through Gaul, but now the tables are about to turn in the most dramatic way possible. The Gauls have a new leader, Vercingetorix, and he's not just another chief. He's a visionary, a unifier, and he's about to unleash a strategy so brutal, so desperate, and so brilliant that it will push Caesar to the absolute limit. This is the story of fire, sacrifice, and a nation's will to survive. This is the scorched earth. Imagine the scene. It's 52 CE, Caesar's legions, the most disciplined and effective fighting force in the known world, are deep in Gallic territory. They've been winning for years, living off the land, seizing grain from Gallic farms, and using captured towns as supply depots. Their entire war machine runs on the resources of the very people they are conquering. Vercingetorix, having united the tribes against this common enemy, understands this critical vulnerability. He knows he can't defeat the Romans in a straight-up, pitched battle. Not yet. The legions are too experienced, too organized. So, if you can't beat your enemy on the battlefield, what do? You starve them. You freeze them. You take away everything they need to survive. Vercingetorix calls a council of the Gallic chieftains. The mood is tense. They've suffered defeat after defeat. But Vercingetorix's presence is electrifying. He lays out his plan, and it is horrifying. He tells his own people, the men and women he has sworn to protect, that they must destroy their own livelihoods. He commands them to burn their own fields, torch their own granaries, and set fire to their own towns and villages. Everything that cannot be defended must be reduced to ash. The goal is simple and devastating. Create a barren wasteland, a scorched earth, between the Gallic people and the advancing Roman army. There will be no food for Caesar's men, no shelter, no supplies to plunder. The Roman war machine will grind to a halt, starved into submission. Can you even comprehend the weight of this command? This wasn't just a military tactic. It was an immense, collective sacrifice. He was asking farmers to set fire to the harvest that was meant to feed their children through the winter. He was asking families to abandon the homes their ancestors had built, leaving them as nothing but smoking ruins. This strategy is a testament to two things: the sheer desperation of the Gauls, and the incredible charisma and authority of Vercingetorix. He convinced thousands of people that this self-inflicted devastation was their only path to freedom. He argued that the temporary suffering of losing their property was a small price to pay to avoid the permanent suffering of Roman slavery and occupation. It was a gamble of epic proportions, betting everything on the idea that Gallic resolve would outlast Roman hunger. And the Gauls listened. According to Caesar's own writings, On a single day, more than 20 towns in the territory of the Bitreges tribe were set ablaze. Picture the sky darkened with smoke, the horizon glowing with the fires of their own making. It must have been an apocalyptic sight. This was not chaos. It was a coordinated, strategic act of defiance. The Gauls were demonstrating, in the most powerful way imaginable, that they would rather have nothing than let the Romans have anything. They were turning their own land into a weapon. Caesar, a master of logistics himself, was stunned. His campaign depended on a steady flow of supplies. His foraging parties, which usually returned with carts full of grain, were now coming back empty-handed, harassed by Vercingetorix's swift cavalry who patrolled the burned-out lands. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to regular rations, began to feel the gnawing pangs of hunger. Their morale, once unbreakable, started to fray. The cold of the Gallic winter bit deeper without the promise of a warm billet in a captured town. Caesar was in a trap. Every step forward took his army deeper into a wasteland, further from his own supply lines, and closer to starvation. But the plan, as brilliant as it was, had a fatal flaw. One city, a jewel of the Bitreges tribe, was spared the flames. Its name was Aver. The leaders of Avericum pleaded with Vercingetorix. They argued that their city was one of the most beautiful in all of Gaul, and more importantly, that it was naturally defensible, protected by rivers and marshes on nearly all sides. They believed they could hold it against the Romans. Reluctantly, against his better judgment, Vercingetorix relented. He agreed to let them try to defend it, a decision that would have profound consequences. For Caesar, the site of Avericum, standing intact amidst the desolation, was a beacon of hope. It was the one prize the Gauls had left on the table. He knew that if he could take it, he could seize the massive stores of grain and supplies stockpiled within its walls. The city became a focal point for the entire campaign. It was no longer just about conquest. It was about survival. The Romans, driven by desperation and hunger, threw everything they had at the city's defenses. The siege of Avericum would become one of the most grueling and brutal episodes of the entire Gallic wars. The scorched earth strategy had successfully cornered Caesar, forcing his hand. It had demonstrated Vercingetorix's iron will and his ability to command incredible sacrifice from his people. He had fundamentally changed the nature of the war, transforming it from a series of battles into a grueling test of endurance and logistics. The question now was, could the defenders of Avericum hold out long enough for hunger to defeat the Roman legions, or had Vercingetorix's single moment of compromise given Caesar the very lifeline he needed to survive and turn the tide of the war once more? The fate of Gaul now hung on the walls of this one defiant city. This chapter of the war shows us the brutal reality of ancient warfare, where a leader's genius is measured not just in battlefield victories, but in their willingness to make impossible choices. Vercingetorix chose to sacrifice the present for a chance at the future, a strategy as courageous as it was cruel. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. It's these moments of incredible human drama that make the past so compelling. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the annals of history. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll witness the epic and tragic siege of Avericum. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on Caesar's Gallic Wars. Today, we're rediving into one of the most dramatic and pivotal moments of the entire conflict, the siege of Gergovia. This isn't just another battle. This is the story of how one man, Vercingetorix, delivered a stunning blow to the seemingly invincible Julius Caesar, a defeat that would echo across all of Gaul and change the course of the war. So, set the scene. It's 52 BC. The Great Gallic Revolt is in full swing, and Vercingetorix is proven to be a formidable and cunning adversary. After the brutal Roman sack of Avericum, he adopted a scorched earth policy, denying Caesar's legions the supplies they desperately needed. Vercingetorix understood he couldn't beat the Romans in a straightforward, pitched battle. Their discipline and engineering were just too superior. So, he chose his ground carefully, retreating to the nearly impregnable oppidum, or fortified town, of Gergovia. Now, Gergovia wasn't just any hill fort. It was his home turf, the capital of his own tribe. They are perched high on a plateau, with steep, treacherous slopes on almost every side. It was a natural fortress. Imagine trying to assault that. Vercingetorix knew this land like the back of his hand. He positioned his forces not just within the walls, but also on the surrounding hills, creating a layered defense that would make any direct assault a nightmare. He was daring Caesar to come and get him. Caesar, ever the aggressor and supremely confident in his legions, accepted the challenge. He arrived at Gergovia and was immediately struck by the sheer difficulty of the task ahead. A direct assault on the main town was out of the question. It would be suicidal. So, he did what he did best. He started with engineering. He established a large base camp and then noticed a smaller, strategically important hill closer to the This hill, if captured, could disrupt the Gauls' access to their primary water source and give the Romans a launch pad for further operations. In a swift and classic Roman maneuver, Caesar launched a surprise night attack and seized this smaller hill. His legionaries immediately began to dig in, constructing a second, smaller camp. Then came the truly brilliant part, a hallmark of Roman military engineering. Caesar ordered his men to construct a massive double trench, a parallel communication trench about 12 feet wide, connecting the two Roman camps. This trench would allow him to move troops and supplies between the camps, completely protected from Gallic attacks. It was a siege within a siege, a physical manifestation of Roman dominance and discipline, right under Vercingetorix's nose. But Vercingetorix was not idle. He watched every Roman move, adapting his strategy. He saw the danger posed by the second Roman camp in the communication trench. While the Romans were busy digging, Gallic cavalry and archers constantly harassed them, trying to slow their progress. There were daily skirmishes, small but bloody encounters that tested the resolve of both sides. This period was a tense chess match, with each commander trying to outthink and outmaneuver the other. It was during this time that a critical weakness in Caesar's position began to emerge, not on the battlefield, but within his alliances. He had long relied on the Aedui, a powerful Gallic tribe that had been Roman allies for decades. But the spirit of rebellion, fanned by Vercingetorix's initial successes, was contagious. Whispers of betrayal started to circulate. Aeduan nobles, swayed by patriotic fervor and anti-Roman sentiment, began to plot. They saw a chance to throw off the Roman yoke, and Vercingetorix's stand at Gergovia was the inspiration they needed. The situation escalated dramatically when a contingent of Aegean troops sent to reinforce Caesar mutinied on the march. Led by a noble named Ludovicus, they killed the Roman officers, escorting them, and declared their allegiance to Vercingetorix. This was a disaster for Caesar. Not only was he losing crucial allies, but their betrayal threatened his supply lines and the loyalty of other Gallic auxiliaries in his army. He was forced to make a difficult choice. He had to leave the siege at Gergovia, taking 4 of his 6 legions on a rapid forced march to confront the Aegean rebels before the situation spiraled completely out of control. He left his trusted legate, Gaius Fabius, in command of the 2 remaining legions at Gergovia, with strict orders to simply hold the line and not be drawn into a major battle. Caesar's gamble paid off. He managed to intercept the Aegean force, convincing the common soldiers that they had been deceived. The rebellion was quelled, for now, but his absence from Gergovia had created a window of opportunity. Back at the siege, Fabius was having a tough time. Vercingetorix, sensing weakness, and perhaps believing Caesar was in full retreat, ramped up the pressure on the Roman camps. The attacks were relentless. When Caesar finally returned, he found his men exhausted, and the situation more precarious than when he left. He knew he had to regain the initiative. He couldn't afford a long, drawn-out siege, especially with the loyalty of Gaul hanging in the balance. He needed a decisive action. Caesar devised a bold, if risky, plan. He noticed that one section of the Gallic defenses, on the slopes leading up to the Oppidum, seemed less heavily guarded. His plan was to create a diversion. He would send some troops on a noisy march around one side of the fortress, drawing the attention of Vercingetorix and his warriors. While the Gauls were distracted, his main force would launch a surprise assault on that weaker section of the wall. The goal wasn't necessarily to take the entire city in one go, but to storm the outer defenses, cause chaos, inflict damage, and then pull back in good order. It was meant to be a show of force, to demoralize the Gauls and reassert Roman superiority. The plan started perfectly. The diversion worked. Vercingetorix and his men rushed to defend the area they thought was under threat. Meanwhile, Caesar gave the signal. The legions surged forward, their battle cries echoing across the valley. They quickly overran the outer Gallic camps. The Aegean troops, now back on the Roman side, were particularly eager to prove their renewed loyalty and charged forward with fury. They stormed up the slopes and were the first to reach the walls of Gergovia itself. And this is where everything went wrong. This is the moment where victory turned into a bloody defeat. The initial success went to the legionaries' heads. Intoxicated by the thrill of the assault and perhaps driven by a thirst for revenge after the hardships of the siege, they ignored the signal to retreat. The trumpet call for withdrawal, the sound that should have brought them back to the safety of the Roman lines, was either not heard in the chaos or was deliberately disregarded. Instead of pulling back as planned, the soldiers, including elements of the famed 10th Legion, pushed on. They pressed their attack on the town walls, trying to scale them, believing they could take the entire fortress. This was exactly what Vercingetorix had been waiting for. The diversion was over. He realized what was happening and wheeled his main force, including his elite cavalry, around to smash into the overextended and disorganized Romans. Suddenly, the attackers were the ones being attacked. They were trapped on steep, unfamiliar ground, far from the support of their main army. Gallic warriors poured out of the town and swarmed down the slopes. The Romans, who had been charging uphill, were now fighting for their lives against a tide of fresh, determined defenders on their home ground. The Aeduans, who had been leading the charge, were mistaken for enemies by some of the legionaries, due to their similar armor, adding to the confusion and panic. The retreat turned into a rout. The Romans were cut down as they tried to scramble back down the slopes. The Gauls showed no mercy. It was a scene of utter chaos and carnage. Caesar, watching from a lower position, was horrified. He threw his reserve forces forward to try and cover the retreat and prevent a complete annihilation of his men. The fighting was desperate and hand-to-hand, but they managed to stabilize the line just enough for the survivors to straggle back. When the dust settled, the scale of the disaster was clear. Caesar had lost nearly 700 men, including 46 of his battle-hardened centurions, the very backbone of his legions. It was a staggering loss, one of the worst he had ever suffered. For the first time in the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar had been decisively beaten in a major engagement. He had underestimated his opponent and lost control of his own men at the critical moment. The next day, Caesar assembled his army. He didn't shy away from the failure. He addressed his troops, acknowledging their bravery but sternly rebuking them for their indiscipline and for allowing their lust for glory to override his direct orders. He took responsibility as the commander, but made it clear that victory is only possible through discipline. Despite the brave face, he knew he could not stay. The siege was broken. His position was untenable, and the news of his defeat would spread like wildfire, igniting the rest of Gaul against him. Humiliated, Caesar gave the order to pack up camp and withdraw from Gergovia. For Vercingetorix and the Gauls, it was a moment of supreme triumph. They had faced the might of Rome, led by the legendary Caesar himself, and they had won. Vercingetorix had proven that the Romans were not invincible. This victory galvanized the entire Gallic resistance. Tribes that had been wavering, including the powerful Aedui, who now officially renounced their alliance with Rome, flocked to his banner. He was declared commander-in-chief of all the Gallic armies. The rebellion was no longer a scattered uprising. It was now a unified national war for independence. The siege of Gergovia was a turning point. It was Caesar's darkest hour in Gaul and Vercingetorix's brightest. It demonstrated the Gallic chieftain's brilliant strategic mind and set the stage for the final, epic confrontation of the war last stand that would decide the fate of Gaul itself. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter in our epic story. Gergovia is such a crucial moment, and it really shows the human side of this conflict. The mistakes, the passion, and the incredible stakes. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of our journey. We'd love to have you with us as we march towards the final siege at Alesia. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to our journey through the Gallic Wars. Last time, we left Caesar reeling from his first major personal defeat at the siege of Gergovia. A lesser man might have crumbled, his spirit broken. But this wasn't just any man. This was Julius Caesar, and for him, defeat wasn't an end, it was a lesson. Chapter 11 isn't a story of immediate, fiery revenge. It's something far more terrifying. The story of a genius learning from his mistakes. Imagine the scene. The Roman legions, their pride wounded, retreat from Gergovia. The air is thick, not just with dust, but with doubt. Their aura of invincibility has been shattered. The Gauls, electrified by their victory under Vercingetorix, are uniting like never before. From every corner of Gaul, warriors are flocking to his banner, convinced that the Roman serpent can finally be driven from their lands. For Caesar, this was the ultimate test. His reputation, the loyalty of his men, and Rome's entire position in Gaul hung by a thread. But instead of rash action, Caesar demonstrated one of his most formidable qualities. He schooled patience. He didn't immediately charge back towards Gergovia, seeking a quick, emotional victory. No, he did the opposite. He retreated, regrouped, and reflected. He analyzed every detail of the failed siege. Was it the overzealousness of his centurions? Was it the treacherous terrain? Was it his own underestimation of Vercingetorix? The answer was a combination of all three. Caesar, the master strategist, had been outmaneuvered, and he would not let it happen again. This period reveals the core of Roman military discipline. Caesar addressed his legions not with anger, but with a cold, hard dose of reality. He didn't blame them. He took responsibility, but also reminded them of their duty, their training, and their past victories. He acknowledged the courage that had tipped into recklessness at Gergovia and turned it into a teachable moment. He spoke of how overconfidence is a greater enemy than any Gallic warrior. This wasn't just a speech. It was a psychological reset. He was reforging their morale, tempering their shame into a focused, disciplined resolve. The legions were reminded that they were not just a collection of soldiers. They were a single, unstoppable Roman war machine. While Caesar was rebuilding his army's spirit, he was also reinforcing its strength. He knew the Gallic advantage was their cavalry, emboldened by their recent successes. So, Caesar did something unthinkable for a proud Roman commander. He looked for help beyond his legions. He sent word across the Rhine River to the Germanic tribes, Rome's long-standing adversaries. He wasn't asking for infantry. He had the best in the world. He was hiring their cavalry. He swallowed his pride and recruited fierce Germanic horsemen, renowned for their skill and ferocity. He even went so far as to give these new allies the horses of his own Roman officers, showing that victory was more important than status. This was classic Caesar. Pragmatic, adaptable, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of an advantage. With his forces reorganized and his cavalry bolstered, Caesar began to move. But this was not a triumphant march. It was a silent, deliberate advance. Every step was calculated. He avoided direct confrontations where Vercingetorix held the advantage. Instead, he maneuvered, using the landscape to his advantage, forcing the Gallic leader to react to him. He was like a master chess player, sacrificing pawns to set up a checkmate. His goal was no longer just to win a single battle, but to corner the entire Gallic rebellion. He needed to lure Vercingetorix into a decisive engagement on ground of his own choosing. The Gauls, meanwhile, were riding a wave of confidence. Vercingetorix believed Caesar was in full retreat, heading back to the Roman province. He decided the time was right to strike a crippling blow. He would attack the Romans on the march, using his superior cavalry to harass and destroy their supply lines, and eventually the legions themselves. It was a bold plan, born from the victory at Gergovia. But Vercingetorix made a fatal error. He mistook Caesar's patience for weakness. He underestimated the silent, coiled fury of the Roman legions and their commander. As the Gallic cavalry thundered down upon the marching Roman column, they expected to find a disorganized, demoralized army. Instead, they hit a wall. Caesar had anticipated the attack. The Roman legions formed a defensive square, their shields locked, their javelins ready. And then, Caesar unleashed his secret weapon, the Germanic cavalry. These warriors, fighting with a ferocity the Gauls had not anticipated, crashed into the Gallic horsemen. The battle in the open field was chaotic and brutal. It was a swirling melee of horse and steel, a true test of cavalry supremacy. And the new Roman cavalry, the German mercenaries, proved their worth. They broke the Gallic charge. They shattered their momentum. Vercingetorix watched in horror as his greatest advantage was neutralized, then turned against him. The hunters had become the hunted. Seeing the Gallic cavalry falter, the Roman legions advanced, a relentless tide of disciplined steel. The tide of the war had just turned, decisively and bloodily, on an open plain. The trap Caesar had so patiently set was about to spring shut. Vercingetorix, his cavalry scattered and his strategy in ruins, was forced into a desperate retreat. He fell back with what remained of his army to the fortified hilltop town of Alesia. He believed he could replicate his success at Gergovia, holding out in an impregnable fortress until Caesar's army starved. But Caesar had learned his lesson. He wasn't going to assault the walls of Alesia. He had a different, far more ambitious and terrifying plan. The silent march was over. Now, the final, epic siege of the Gallic Wars was about to begin. Caesar had cornered his prey, and he would now build a cage around him unlike any the world had ever seen. The defeat at Gergovia was not the beginning of the end for Caesar. It was the end of the beginning. It forced him to evolve, to become more cautious, more cunning, and more relentless. It transformed him from a brilliant general into an unstoppable force of nature. The comeback was complete, and the stage was set for Alesia, one of the most incredible military engagements in all of human history. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Caesar's comeback. The story of Alesia is next, and you won't want to miss it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see how this epic conflict concludes, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you then. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the Gallic Wars. Last time, we saw Caesar narrowly escape disaster at Gergovia. Today, the tables turned dramatically. This is the story of Alesia, a siege so audacious, so colossal, it would echo through the annals of military history for millennia. This is Chapter 12. The Trap at Alesia. After the morale boost at Gergovia, Vercingetorix, the charismatic leader of the united Gallic tribes, felt the tide was turning in his favor. He decided to press his advantage, launching a massive cavalry attack on Caesar's legions as they marched. But he underestimated Roman discipline and Caesar's tactical genius. The Roman cavalry, reinforced by their Germanic allies, not only repelled the attack but shattered the Gallic horsemen, sending them into a full-blown rout. This defeat was a severe blow to Vercingetorix. His greatest strength, his cavalry, had been broken. Realizing he could no longer face Caesar in open battle, he made a fateful decision to retreat and make a stand at the fortified hill town, or Oppidum, of Alesia. He gathered his remaining forces, about 80,000 warriors, inside its formidable walls. Alesia was perched atop a high plateau, protected by steep slopes and two rivers. From this seemingly impregnable position, Vercingetorix planned to wait for reinforcements from all corners of Gaul to arrive, and crush the Romans between the city walls and the relief army. It seemed like a solid plan. Alesia was well stocked, and the combined might of Gaul would surely be enough to overwhelm Caesar's weary legions. He had laid a trap for the Romans, or so he thought. When Caesar arrived at Alesia, he surveyed the situation. His 50,000 men were faced with 80,000 defenders in a natural fortress. A direct assault would be suicidal. Retreating would mean abandoning years of conquest and admitting defeat. So, Caesar decided on a plan so bold, so outrageously ambitious, it bordered on madness. If he couldn't storm the fortress, he would seal it off from the world. He would besiege the besieged. Thus began one of the most incredible feats of military engineering in history. Caesar ordered his men to construct a massive wall of encirclement, a contravallation, completely surrounding Alesia. This was not just a simple wall. It was an 11-mile-long system of fortifications, complete with trenches, ramparts, watchtowers every 80 feet, and a terrifying array of hidden traps. There were pits with sharpened stakes, known as lilies, and smaller holes with embedded iron hooks, gruesomely nicknamed spurs. The Romans worked day and night, their shovels and axes reshaping the landscape around Alesia. Vercingetorix watched from the walls as this ring of wood and earth slowly tightened around him. He realized his mistake. He wasn't trapping Caesar. Caesar was trapping... him. He launched desperate cavalry attacks to disrupt the construction, but the Roman legionaries, protected by their own field fortifications, held firm. Vercingetorix knew he had to get word out. Before the circle was complete, he dispatched his remaining cavalry, ordering them to ride to every tribe in Gaul and summon a massive relief army. Their mission was clear: gather every man capable of fighting and return to break the siege. With his messengers gone, the final section of the wall was completed. The trap was sprung. Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors were now prisoners in their own fortress. But Caesar wasn't finished. He knew that a Gallic relief army was coming. He was about to be caught between the hammer of the relief force and the anvil of Vercingetorix's army inside Alesia. So, what did he do? He built another wall. This second line of fortifications, the circumvallation, faced outwards. It was 30 miles long, even more formidable than the first, designed to protect the Romans from the coming attack. In essence, Caesar had built a donut of death, a fortress of his own, with his legions sandwiched between two hostile armies. He was besieging Alesia, while simultaneously preparing to be besieged himself. The logistical and engineering challenge was immense. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, who were also warriors, became lumberjacks, carpenters, and engineers. They felled entire forests and moved mountains of earth to create this double-walled prison. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine a circular fortress, nearly 40 kilometers in circumference, built by hand in a matter of weeks, deep in enemy territory, while being constantly harassed by the enemy. It's a testament to the discipline, engineering skill, and sheer audacity of the Roman army under Caesar. In Alesia, the situation grew desperate. Food began to run low. The Gauls watched day after day as the Roman fortifications grew stronger, their hope dwindling with their supplies. Vercingetorix had to ration what little food was left, knowing that his people's survival depended entirely on the arrival of the relief army. The tension was unbearable. Every sunrise brought them closer to starvation. Then, one day, they saw it. On the distant hills, a glimmer of sunlight on metal. Standards and banners appeared, stretching as far as the eye could see. The Gallic relief army had arrived. According to Caesar's own account, a staggering 250,000 warriors had answered the call, led by Vercingetorix's cousin, Vercingetorix. A roar of triumph erupted from the walls of Alesia. Their salvation was at hand. For the Romans, caught in their own trap, it was the moment of truth. They were outnumbered more than 5 to 1, sandwiched between two enormous enemy forces. The final, desperate battle for Gaul was about to begin. The Gauls on the outside launched their first assault on the Roman outer wall. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix led his starving warriors out of Alesia to attack the inner wall. The Romans were now fighting a war on two fronts. The noise was deafening: the clash of swords, the whir of slings, the screams of the fighting men, and the blare of trumpets from both sides. Caesar rode along the lines, his presence everywhere, urging his men to hold. He told them this was it, the culmination of all their years of hardship and battle. Victory here would mean the conquest of all Gaul. Defeat would mean their complete annihilation. The fighting was savage. The Gauls, driven by desperation and overwhelming numbers, threw themselves against the Roman fortifications. They filled the trenches and swarmed the ramparts, only to be met by a disciplined wall of Roman shields and steel. The traps Caesar had laid took a dreadful toll. The first day's assault was repulsed, but the Gauls were far from beaten. The next day, under the cover of darkness, the Gauls launched another, more coordinated attack. They came prepared with grappling hooks and ladders, focusing their efforts on a section of the Roman lines that was built on a steep, difficult slope, a potential weak point. The battle raged through the night, a chaotic and brutal affair illuminated by torches. Again, the Romans, though stretched to their absolute limit, managed to hold on. The discipline and superior engineering of their defenses bent but did not break. The Gallic commanders realized a simple frontal assault wasn't working. They devised a new plan. Vercingetorix took 60,000 of his best warriors on a long night, march around the Roman lines to attack a hidden weak spot, a camp on a northern hill that could be fully integrated into the main fortification ring. At the same time, the main force would launch a massive diversionary attack on the front, and Vercingetorix would sally out from Alesia once more. It was a well-designed three-pronged assault intended to finally overwhelm the Romans. As dawn broke, the final, epic battle began. The main Gallic army surged forward, their shouts echoing across the plain. From inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his men charged towards the inner wall, and from the north, Vercingetorix's elite force crashed down upon the weakened Roman camp. The Roman lines began to buckle. The situation was critical. Caesar, seeing the northern camp about to collapse, gathered his remaining reserves and made a decision that would define his legend. He sent his trusted subordinate Labienus with several cohorts to reinforce the northern sector, telling him to hold at all costs. Then, wearing his famous scarlet cloak for all his men to see, Caesar himself rode into the thickest of the fighting, inspiring his beleaguered troops. But it wasn't enough. The northern camp was about to fall. In the ultimate gamble, Caesar pulled cavalry and infantry from other, less pressured sections of the line and personally led them out of the fortifications, riding around the rear of Vercingetorix's attacking force. The Gauls on the northern hill suddenly heard shouting and trumpets from behind them. They looked back and saw Caesar's scarlet cloak and the Roman cavalry charging down on their rear. At the same time, Labienus's troops, reinvigorated by the sight of their general, launched a furious counterattack from the front. Panicked and caught between two Roman forces, the elite Gallic unit broke and fled. The sight of their best warriors running for their lives shattered the morale of the entire Gallic relief army. The attack across the plain faltered, then turned into a full-scale rout. The Romans pursued them, and the slaughter was immense. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix watched his last hope dissolve into chaos. His relief army was destroyed. His own men were starving and exhausted. The fight was over. The next day, the gates of Alesia opened. Vercingetorix, in his finest armor, rode out and surrendered himself to Caesar, throwing his weapons at the proconsul's feet. The great Gallic rebellion was crushed. The siege of Alesia was over, and with it, 8 years of brutal warfare came to an end. Gaul was conquered. Alesia stands as Caesar's ultimate masterpiece, a victory against impossible odds achieved through brilliant engineering, unshakable discipline, and a general's willingness to risk everything at the decisive moment. It secured his place as one of history's greatest military commanders. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible chapter of history. It's a story that truly shows the extremes of human ingenuity and endurance. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through Caesar's Gallic Wars. Today, we delve into one of the most grueling and desperate chapters of the entire conflict, the long siege of Alesia. This isn't a story of swift, glorious charges. It's a slow, suffocating tale of starvation, desperation, and the sheer force of human will. Imagine yourself trapped inside the walls of Alesia. Vercingetorix, the charismatic leader of the United Gauls, gathered his people here, believing it to be an impregnable fortress, but he underestimated his opponent. Caesar, with his trademark audacity and engineering genius, didn't just lay siege to the city. He built a fortress around the fortress, a massive, double-walled circle, stretching for miles, designed to keep the Gauls in and any potential rescuers out. As days turned into weeks, the mood inside Alesia soured. The initial confidence curdled into quiet fear. Food, once plentiful, became the most precious commodity. Every scrap was rationed. The laughter of children faded from the streets, replaced by the hollow cries of hunger. The warriors who had sworn to fight to the death now watched their families waste away. The air grew thick with the stench of despair. Vercingetorix faced an impossible choice. His people were starving. He had to make a decision that would haunt the annals of history. In a council of war, a nobleman named Critagnatus delivered a chilling speech. He argued that surrendering was unthinkable. He proposed a horrifying alternative. To sustain the fighting men, they should consume the bodies of those unfit for war, women, the children, the elderly. While Caesar reports this speech, it's unclear if this desperate act was ever carried out. What is certain is that the non-combatants were expelled from the city, sent towards the Roman lines in the hope that Caesar would take them as prisoners, or at least let them pass. But Caesar, his own supplies stretched thin and his focus absolute, refused. He would not allow them through his lines. And so, in the no man's land between the city walls and the Roman fortifications, thousands of innocent people were trapped, starving to death under the eyes of both armies. It's a brutal, heart-wrenching image that starkly illustrates the merciless reality of ancient warfare. There was no room for compassion, only the cold, hard logic. A victory. Just as all hope seemed to vanish within Alesia, a distant roar echoed across the plains. It was the sound the besieged had been praying for, the sound the Romans had been dreading. The Gallic relief army had finally arrived, a massive force, said to be 250,000 strong, a confederation of tribes from all corners of Gaul, marching to break the siege and crush Caesar once and for all. From the walls of Alesia, the starving defenders watched with renewed hope. Their brothers had come. The final, decisive battle was at hand. For Caesar and his legions, this was the ultimate test. They were now the ones besieged, caught between Vercingetorix's desperate army inside and the massive relief force on the outside. They were outnumbered, isolated, and fighting on two fronts. The Gauls outside, led by Vercingetorix's cousin, Commius, launched their first assault. They threw everything they had at Caesar's outer wall. A storm of arrows, stones, and javelins rained down on the Roman defenders. The air was filled with the cacophony of war cries, the clash of steel, and the screams of the wounded. The Romans, disciplined and resolute, held their ground. Every legionary knew that this was not just a battle. It was a fight for their very survival. If these walls fell, they would be annihilated, hundreds of miles from home. Inside the fortifications, Caesar was everywhere. He rode along the lines, his iconic red cloak making him a visible beacon of command. He rallied his men, shouting encouragement, reminding them of their past victories and the glory that awaited them. His presence was electric. He wasn't just a general, he was a comrade, sharing the danger, inspiring his men to push beyond the limits of exhaustion and fear. The first Gallic assault was repulsed, but it was only the beginning. The next day, under the cover of darkness, the Gauls tried again. They prepared fascines to fill the Roman ditches and grappling hooks to tear down the ramparts. They moved silently, hoping to catch the Romans by surprise. But Caesar's men were vigilant. The alarm was raised, and the night erupted into a chaotic, terrifying battle. Fires were lit along the walls, casting long, dancing shadows as men fought and died in brutal, close-quarters combat. Once again, the discipline and superior engineering of the Romans held firm. The Gauls were driven back, leaving behind a trail of dead and wounded. The pressure was immense. Day after day, the assaults continued. The Romans were stretched to their breaking point, constantly moving reinforcements to threaten sectors of the wall. The psychological toll was immense. For the Gauls inside Alesia, each failed attack was another nail in their coffin. They could see their saviors fighting and dying for them. Yet, the Roman wall remained unbroken. Their own food supplies were now completely gone. Hope, which had surged with the arrival of the relief army, began to dwindle once more, replaced by the grim realization that their fate was sealed. This long siege wasn't just a physical battle. It was a war of minds, a contest of endurance between two of history's greatest commanders. Vercingetorix, trapped and desperate, relied on the sheer numbers and fighting spirit of his people. Caesar, outnumbered and surrounded, relied on the discipline, engineering, and unwavering loyalty of his legions. The fate of Gaul hung in the balance, suspended on the edge of a knife, in the mud and blood surrounding the fortress of Alesia. The final, cataclysmic confrontation was yet to come, and it would decide everything. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of the story. The Siege of Alesia is a powerful reminder of the extremes of human conflict. If you found this compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll cover the final, desperate battle for Alesia. See you next time. The hills around Alesia throbbed with the sound of 100,000 war horns. The Gallic relief army, a vast, seething ocean of warriors, had finally arrived. From their siege lines, the Romans watched, their discipline a stark contrast to the wild energy cresting the horizon. For the trapped Gauls inside the fortress, this was the moment of salvation. A roar of defiance and hope erupted from the walls of Alesia, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Vercingetorix, his face gaunt, but his eyes blazing with renewed fire, stood atop the highest battlement. He raised his sword, and the cry of his people answered him. The final assault was about to begin. Caesar, ever the master of the battlefield, remained unervingly calm. His orders flew with precision. The outer defenses, a labyrinth of ditches, sharpened stakes, and hidden pits, were ready. His legions, outnumbered but not outmatched, stood as a wall of iron and resolve. They were the anvil. The Gauls were the hammer. The question was, which would break first? The first wave of the relief army crashed against the Roman fortifications. It was chaos incarnate. Thousands of warriors, fueled by desperation and a furious love for their land, threw themselves into the deadly maze. The air filled with the splintering of wood, the clang of steel, and the screams of the brave and the dying. The Romans fought with a cold, brutal efficiency, their short swords stabbing and their shields locked together, a machine of war against a force of nature. Inside Alesia Vercingetorix watched the maelstrom. He knew this was his last chance. The supplies were gone. Starvation was not a threat, it was a reality. He could not let his relief army be bled dry on the Roman defenses alone. It had to be a two-front war. To me, he roared, his voice carrying over the din. For a free Gaul. For our children. For our ancestors. We! Cher! The gates of Alesia groaned open, and with Vercingetorix at their head, the starving but spirited warriors surged forth. It was a sight of terrible beauty and profound tragedy. Men who could barely stand now ran toward certain death, their hearts filled with a courage that defied logic. They swept down the slope toward the inner Roman lines, a desperate, final gamble. Now Caesar was caught in the middle, attacked from both within and without. This was the moment of supreme crisis. The pressure on the outer lines was immense. Gallic chieftains lead, charge after charge, their long hair flying, their voices raw from shouting encouragement. They managed to fill ditches with bodies and fascines, creating crude bridges to breach the Roman ramparts. At several points, the Roman line buckled. Centurions roared orders, rallying their men, plugging gaps with their own bodies. If necessary, it was a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. The discipline of the legions was being tested to its absolute limit. The sheer numbers and ferocity of the Gauls were overwhelming. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix's charge slammed into the inner fortifications. His warriors fought with the strength of cornered animals. They tore at the ramparts with their bare hands, clambering over the walls, their eyes fixed on the enemy. Vercingetorix himself was a whirlwind of destruction, his greatsword a blur of silver, cutting down any Roman who dared stand before him. For a moment, it seemed possible. The fury of the Gauls was a tangible force, a storm that threatened to sweep the Romans away. The lines wavered. Centurions fell. The cries of victory began to sound from the Gallic ranks. They could almost taste it. The freedom they had bled for was within their grasp. But Caesar was not just a general. He was a master of crises. Seeing the critical point on the inner line, he gathered his personal bodyguard and a contingent of Germanic cavalry he held in reserve. Donning his famous scarlet cloak so all his men could see him, he personally led the The sight of their commander, the iconic Caesar, charging into the thickest of the fighting had an electrifying effect on the Romans. Their morale soared. Their line, which had bent, did not break. It snapped back with renewed ferocity. The Germanic horsemen, with their wild cries and brutal efficiency, smashed into the flank of Vercingetorix's exhausted forces. The tide turned with shocking speed. The surprise and violence of Caesar's cavalry charge shattered the Gallic momentum. Vercingetorix's warriors, already weakened by starvation, faltered. Confusion turned to panic. The charge disintegrated into a desperate retreat back toward the supposed safety of Alesia. Simultaneously, on the outer perimeter, the relentless Roman discipline began to grind down the Gallic relief army. Having failed to achieve a quick breakthrough, their attack lost its coordination. Roman reinforcements, expertly maneuvered by Caesar's lieutenants like Mark Antony and Labienus, shored up the defenses and began to push back. The Gallic relief army, seeing the charge from Alesia fail and facing the unyielding Roman wall, finally broke. What began as a retreat quickly became a rout. The Roman cavalry was unleashed, and the pursuit was merciless. The dream of a united, free Gaul died in the fields and hills around Alesia that day, drowned in a river of blood. From the walls, Vercingetorix watched the utter collapse of his hopes. He saw his relief army scattered to the winds, and his own warriors cut down as they tried to flee back into the city. The great roar of the Gallic host was replaced by an agonizing silence, punctuated only by the cries of the wounded. The final assault had failed. The next day, a somber council was held within Alesia. The fight was over. There was no more food, no more hope, no more strength. Vercingetorix, the man who had united the tribes and defied the might of Rome, addressed his chieftains one last time. His voice was heavy with the weight of his people's tragedy. He told them he had fought not for his own glory, but for their common liberty. Now, he offered himself to them. They could kill him to appease the Romans, or they could deliver him alive. It was a final, heartbreaking act of leadership. There was no other choice. Dressed in his finest, most ornate armor, Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia alone. He rode slowly, deliberately, to Caesar's camp. The Roman legions, formed up in perfect ranks, watched in silence as the great enemy chieftain approached. He dismounted before Caesar, who was seated on his tribunal. Without a word, Vercingetorix unbuckled his sword and laid it at Caesar's feet. Ethan knelt, surrendering himself and all of Gaul with that single, profound gesture. The chaos and courage of the final assault had ended in the quiet, devastating tragedy of defeat. The bravery of the Gauls had been immense, a fire that burned brilliantly, but in the end, it had been extinguished by the cold, unyielding discipline of Rome. The war for Gaul was over. Thank you so much for joining us on this epic journey through the Gallic Wars. The story of Vercingetorix is one of incredible courage and heartbreaking tragedy. If you found this chapter compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most dramatic moments. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next video. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the annals of history. Today we arrive at a moment that is both tragic and profoundly symbolic. A scene that has echoed through the centuries, capturing the essence of defiance, even in defeat. This is the story of the final surrender of Vercingetorix, the great Gallic chieftain, to the might of Rome, personified by Julius Caesar. Imagine the scene. The year is 52 BC. The long, brutal siege of Alesia has reached its grim conclusion. For weeks, the Gauls, united under Vercingetorix, have been trapped inside their fortress, surrounded by an impenetrable ring of Roman fortifications. A second Gallic army, a massive relief force, has tried to break the siege from the outside, but they too have been repulsed by Caesar's brilliant and ruthless engineering. The air, once filled with the clamor of battle, the clash of steel, and the cries of warriors, has now fallen into an eerie, heavy silence. In the Alesia starvation is rampant. Hope has withered and died. The great rebellion is over. For Vercingetorix, this is the bitterest of pills. He was the one who had finally united the fractious Gallic tribes, the one who had dared to stand against the Roman eagle and, for a time, had even made Caesar taste defeat. He was a charismatic leader, a brilliant strategist, a symbol of Gallic freedom and identity. Now, he faces the ultimate responsibility of a commander, the lives of his people. To continue the fight would mean certain annihilation for everyone within the walls. The only path left is surrender. So, a council is held among the surviving Gallic leaders. The mood is somber, defeated. According to Caesar's own account, Vercingetorix stands before his men. He doesn't make excuses or shift blame. He takes full ownership of the war, stating that he undertook it not for his own gain, but for the common liberty of all Gauls. He offers himself as a sacrifice. He tells them they can either kill him to appease the Romans, or they can hand him over alive. The choice is theirs. It's a moment of incredible gravity. A leader placing his fate entirely in the hands of the men he led to ruin. The Gauls, seeing no other option, decide to send envoys to Caesar to negotiate the surrender. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, is seated on a tribunal before his camp, ready to receive the vanquished. He doesn't seek a parley. He demands submission. And what happens next is one of the most iconic and debated moments in ancient history. The gates of Alesia Creek open. A lone figure on horseback emerges. It is Vercingetorix. Now, ancient sources differ on the details, but the most dramatic account, the one that has truly captured the imagination of artists and poets for 2 millennia, comes from the historian Plutarch. He describes Vercingetorix preparing for this final act with incredible care. He dons his finest armor, the polished metal gleaming in the sun. He mounts his war horse, a magnificent animal that had carried him through so many battles. He isn't coming out as a beggar, pleading for mercy. He is coming out as a king, a warrior, even in this final, desperate act. He rides out from the fortress and circles Caesar's tribunal. It's not a gallop of panic, but a slow, deliberate ride. It's a final display of horsemanship, a final moment of freedom before the chains. It's a performance. He's showing Caesar and the entire Roman army watching who he is. He is the chieftain of the Arverni, the commander of the United Gauls. He is not just some nameless barbarian. After circling, he dismounts. He walks towards Caesar, who sits elevated, looking down. The contrast is stark. The victorious Roman general, composed and in control, and the defeated Gallic warrior, his rebellion in ashes. Vercingetorix doesn't speak. The silence is profound. He begins to strip off his magnificent armor, piece by piece. The helmet that had witnessed so many charges, the greaves, the chestplate. He lays them down at Caesar's feet, and then he takes his sword, the symbol of his power, his resistance, his very identity as a warrior, and he lays that down. This act of laying down the sword is everything. It's the physical manifestation of defeat. It's the end of the Gallic wars. It's the moment one world succumbs to another. But there's also an incredible defiance in it. By performing this ritual with such pride and ceremony, Vercingetorix transforms his surrender from a simple act of submission into a powerful statement. He's saying, "You have beaten me, but you have not broken my spirit. I am a king, and I will surrender as a king." It's an act of defiance, cloaked in the guise of submission. Then, he sits down at Caesar's feet and remains there, silent, without moving, until Roman soldiers come and lead him away. There were no pleas, no negotiations, just a quiet, dignified, and utterly heartbreaking acknowledgement of reality. Caesar, for his part, was not moved by this display of pride. To him, Vercingetorix was a rebel, an enemy of Rome who had caused immense trouble and cost many Roman lives. He saw not a king, but a captive. Vercingetorix was paraded through the streets of Rome 6 years later as the prize exhibit in Caesar's magnificent triumphal procession, a living trophy to celebrate his conquest of Gaul. After the parade, he was taken to the Tullianum, a grim subterranean prison, and was likely ritually strung-led, a common fate for Rome's most prominent defeated enemies. The story of Vercingetorix's surrender is a powerful reminder that history is often written by the victors. For Caesar, this was the logical and necessary conclusion to a difficult campaign. For the Gauls, it was the end of their independence. But in that one quiet, symbolic moment, as a proud warrior laid down his sword, Vercingetorix secured a different kind of victory. He lost the war, but he won a place in history as a timeless symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the enduring spirit of a people fighting for their freedom. His story lives on, a testament to the fact that even in surrender, there can be a form of defiance, a spark of honor that can never be truly extinguished. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most poignant moments. If you've found this story as compelling as I do, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next historical adventure. Let me know in the comments what you think about Vercingetorix's final act. Was it pride, or was it acceptance? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Chains, heavier than any I had ever worn, bit into my wrists. The salt of the sea spray stung my face. A bitter baptism into this new world. Gone were the green hills of Gaul, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. Now, there was only the endless, heaving blue of the Mediterranean and the creak of the ship that bore me towards my doom. Rome, who had commanded legions of my own people, was now a spectacle, a prize. The Roman soldiers, my jailers, spoke in a tongue I was beginning to understand all too well. They spoke of triumphs, of parades, of a man named Caesar. They looked at me not as a man, but as a thing, a symbol of their victory. My name, once a war cry, was now a whisper among my captors, a piece of trivium for their sprawling city. The journey was long, a blur of rocking waves and gray skies. They fed me, kept me alive, but my spirit starved. Each day, I would stare east, imagining I could see the shores of my homeland. I thought of my wife, my children, the warriors who had fallen beside me. Had I failed them? The question was a constant, gnawing companion, more torturous than any physical chain. The Romans wanted a broken barbarian to display. I would not give them that satisfaction. I would hold my head high, even as my heart turned to stone. Finally, we docked at Ostia, the port of Rome. The chaos was overwhelming. The noise, the smells, the sheer number of people. It was a city built by giants and inhabited by ants, all scurrying with a purpose I couldn't comprehend. I was bound and led from the ship, the gawking crowds a suffocating wave. They pointed, they jeered, they threw rotten fruit. Children with wide, curious eyes stared at my long hair and foreign clothes. In their eyes, I saw not hatred, but a terrifying fascination. I was a monster from a storybook, brought to life for their amusement. From Ostia, the road to Rome was paved with the arrogance of conquerors. We passed aqueducts that sliced through valleys, monuments to men I'd never known. This was the heart of the beast, the center of the power that had crushed my world. I was taken to a place they called the Talianum, a grim, subterranean prison near their forum. The light of the sun became a distant memory. My cell was a cold, damp pit, the darkness broken only by a sliver of light from a grate far above. The sounds of the city, the rumble of carts, the shouts of vendors, the distant roar from some coliseum filtered down to me, a constant reminder of the world I was no longer a part of. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The passage of time was marked only by the changing guards, and the meager rations they shoved through a slot in the door. They left me alone with my thoughts, a cruelty more refined than any physical torture. Solitude became my new battlefield. I fought despair, battled madness. I would recite the names of my ancestors, the sagas of my people, anything to keep the fire of my identity from being extinguished by the crushing darkness. I was no longer a chieftain, no longer a warrior. I was simply a prisoner, waiting. My jailer spoke of Caesar's return from his campaigns in Egypt and Pontus. His name was on everyone's lips. And with his return, they said, would come the triumph, a grand parade to celebrate his victories. And I was to be the main attraction, the final, living trophy of his Gallic wars. The thought was a cold dread that settled deep in my bones. To be paraded through the streets of my enemy, a symbol of my people's subjugation, before being ritually strangled at the foot of their Capitoline hill. This was the fate they had designed for me. Sometimes, a senator or a wealthy patrician would come to stare at me. They would peer down through the grate, their faces masks of smug curiosity. They discussed me as if I were a beast in a cage. Look at the barbarian king, they'd say. So this is the man who defied Caesar for so long. I met their gaze with a silence that unnerved them. I would not speak their language. I would not give them the satisfaction of a response. My silence was my last remaining weapon, my final act of defiance. One day, the routine changed. The guards were rougher, more hurried. They dragged me from my cell, my eyes screaming at the sudden, blinding sunlight. I was stripped of my ragged clothes and forced into a mockery of my Gallic attire, cleaned and prepared for the show. They put the chains back on, heavier this time, polished to a gleam for the crowds. The city was a riot of color and sound. Banners flew from every building, and the streets were packed with a roaring mob, their faces turned towards the procession. The triumph began. It was a spectacle of obscene wealth and power. Carts laden with plundered gold and silver, captured weapons and armor, painted billboards depicting scenes from the war. And then came the prisoners, a long, shuffling line of men and women from a dozen conquered lands. I was placed at the very end, just before Caesar's golden chariot. The star of the show. As I was marched through the Via Sacra, the roar of the crowd was deafening. Vercingetorix! They screamed at a name I had not heard spoken aloud in years. It was a strange, disembodying experience. They were cheering for my defeat, for my imminent death. I looked into their faces, a sea of triumphant, jeering, and sometimes even pitying expressions. I kept my eyes forward, my back straight. I would not stumble. I would not bow my head. I was the chieftain of the Arverni, and I would meet my end as one. The procession snaked its way towards the Capitoline Hill. I could see the temple at its summit, the final destination. My heart, which had been a block of ice for years, began to pound in my chest. This was it. The final moments. I thought of the green forests of home, of the faces of my kin. A strange peace settled over me. I had fought. I had lost, but I had not broken. As Caesar's chariot, drawn by 4 white horses, passed me to ascend the hill, he glanced in my direction. For a fleeting second, our eyes met. The conqueror and the conquered. In his gaze, I saw not hatred, but something akin to respect, a cold acknowledgement of the enemy who had cost him so much. Then the moment was gone. Eternit, Hawaii, and the crowd roared his name. I was led to the foot of the hill, to the prison where my journey had begun. The final act was not for public consumption. It was a private, ritualistic conclusion to their glorious day. As the guards shoved me back into the darkness of the Tullianum, the cheers for Caesar still echoing from the world above, I knew my time was at an end. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I did not see the darkness of my cell. I saw the sun setting over the hills of Gaul. I was going home. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most poignant chapters. The story of Vercingetorix is a powerful reminder of the human cost of empire and the enduring spirit of defiance. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible histories to life. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a somber, yet powerful, final chapter, the death of a hero. Our story finds us in the heart of Rome, far from the green fields of Gaul. Here, in the cold, damp darkness of the Tullianum prison, a great warrior awaits his fate. His name is Vercingetorix. Just a few years earlier, this man was the hope of a nation. He was the brilliant chieftain who achieved the impossible, uniting the fiercely independent Gallic tribes against the mightiest empire the world had ever known, Rome. He led them with a fire in his heart and a strategic mind that even his enemy, Julius Caesar, had to respect. He was the symbol of Gallic freedom, a beacon of resistance. But now, that beacon is about to be extinguished. For 6 long years, he has been a prisoner, paraded through the streets of Rome as a trophy in Caesar's triumph, a living testament to Rome's power. His people are scattered, his lands are conquered, and his dream of a free Gaul seems to have died at the siege of Alesia. As he sits in this dungeon, what thoughts might be racing through his mind? Does he think of the battles won, the comrades lost? Does he regret his final, noble sacrifice? To understand the weight of this moment, We have to remember who Vercingetorix was. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a visionary. Before him, the Gauls were a collection of rival tribes, often fighting amongst themselves more than they fought any common enemy. Vercingetorix saw beyond these divisions. He understood that their only chance for survival lay in unity. He traveled from tribe to tribe, using his powerful oratory and magnetic charisma to forge an unprecedented alliance. He convinced them to set aside their old rivalries and stand together as one people, as Gauls. This unity was his greatest achievement. He created a national identity where none had truly existed before. He implemented a scorched earth policy, a painful but necessary strategy, asking his own people to burn their towns and farms, to deny supplies to the Roman legions. It was a testament to their faith in him that they followed this brutal command. They believed in the future he was fighting for. His military genius was undeniable. At the Battle of Gergovia, he handed Julius Caesar one of his only major defeats. He outsmarted and outmaneuvered the legendary Roman general, proving that the barbarians were more than a match for the legions. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like the dream of a free Gaul was within reach. The Romans were on the back foot, and the spirit of the rebellion was soaring. But war is relentless, and fortune is fickle. The tide turned at Alesia, trapped and besieged by Caesar's ingenious fortifications. Vercingetorix and his massive army were slowly starved into submission. The relief army, the last hope of Gaul, was shattered against the Roman walls. Faced with the starvation of his people, men, women, and children alike, Vercingetorix made the ultimate choice of a leader. He didn't fight to the last man in a blaze of futile glory. He didn't try to escape and save himself. Instead, he put on his finest armor, mounted his warhorse, and rode out of the fortress alone. He rode directly to Caesar's camp, a defiant and majestic figure even in surrender. He laid down his weapons at Caesar's feet, taking full responsibility for the war. He offered his own life in exchange for the lives of his people. It was an act of profound sacrifice, the final service of a king to his subjects. Caesar ever, the pragmatist, accepted. He had his prize. Vercingetorix was chained and taken to Rome. His surrender marked the end of the Gallic Wars and the end of Celtic independence in Gaul. For Rome, it was a total victory. And so we return to the darkness of the Tullianum. The year is 46 BC. The sounds of the city celebrating Caesar's triumph have long since faded. For Vercingetorix, there is only the silence and the waiting. We don't know for certain how he died. The most common account is that he was ritually strung-led, a common fate for Rome's most prominent enemies. A quiet, ignominious end for a man who lived with such fire. From a Roman perspective, this was simply tying up a loose end. Justice served. An enemy of the state eliminated. His story was over. But was it? Is a story of such courage and sacrifice ever truly over? No. Because Vercingetorix's story is not a tale of defeat. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. He lost the war. Yes, Gaul was absorbed into the Roman Empire. But the idea he fought for, idea of unity, of a shared identity, of fighting for your home against impossible odds, that idea did not die in the dungeon with him. He showed his people and the world what they could achieve when they stood together. He created a legend that would sleep for centuries, buried under Roman roads and Latin culture, only to be reawakened. In the 19th century, as France was forging its own modern national identity, it looked back into the mists of history and found him. Vercingetorix was reborn as the first national hero of France. He became a symbol of French patriotism, of resistance against foreign invaders, a reminder of the nation's deep, pre-Roman roots. Statues were erected in his honor. His story was taught to every school child. He became an icon, representing the eternal French spirit of liberty and defiance. The man who was executed as a failed rebel was now celebrated as the founding father of a nation's soul. So, when we think of Vercingetorix, let's not remember him as a captive in chains. Let's remember the charismatic leader who united a people. Let's remember the brilliant general who defeated Caesar. Let's remember the selfless hero who offered his life for his followers. His physical life ended in a Roman prison, but his legacy, a story of unity, courage, and sacrifice has echoed through millennia and continues to inspire us today. He teaches us that some defeats are more glorious than victories, and that true heroism is not about winning, but about the ideals you are willing to die for. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible story. If you found this chapter of history as moving as I do, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. We'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a monumental figure, a name that echoes through the millennia, Gaius Julius Caesar. We stand at the pinnacle of his career. Chapter 18. Caesar's Triumph and Legacy. It's a story of unparalleled ambition, military genius, and political mastery. But it is also a story that forces us to ask difficult questions about the very nature of greatness and the price of glory. Let's set the scene. Imagine the streets of Rome, choked with cheering crowds, the air thick with the scent of laurels and sacrificial smoke. This is the stage for Caesar's quadruple triumph. In 46 BCIA, celebration of his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. For days, the city was a spectacle. Parades of captured soldiers, exotic animals from distant lands, and wagons overflowing with treasure wound their way through the forum. This was more than just a military parade. It was a carefully choreographed display of power, a declaration that Caesar was not just a general, but the master of the known world. He was presenting himself as the man who had pacified Rome's frontiers, enriched its coffers, and secured its future. For the average Roman citizen, this was the dawn of a new golden age. The civil wars seemed over, and a strong leader was finally in charge. Caesar's popularity was immense. He was the hero who had brought stability and splendor back to the Republic. His triumphs were a testament to his incredible military campaigns, particularly the conquest of Gaul. Over nearly a decade, Caesar and his legions systematically subdued the disparate Gallic tribes, a feat that had eluded Rome for centuries. His commentaries, the Bello Gallico, provide a first-hand, albeit biased, account of these wars. He portrays himself as a decisive, brilliant commander, constantly outmaneuvering his enemies, sharing the hardships of his men, and winning their undying loyalty. And in many ways, he was. The Siege of Alesia is a masterclass in military engineering and strategy, where he defeated a massive Gallic relief force while simultaneously pinning down Vercingetorix. Inside the fortress, this victory effectively broke the back of Gallic resistance and secured the entire region for Rome. From a purely Roman perspective, this was a staggering achievement. Gaul represented a vast territory, rich in resources and manpower, which would now fuel the Roman economy and military for generations to come. Caesar had not just won a war, he had redrawn the map of Europe, but this is where our reflection must deepen. As we stand in awe of the spectacle of Caesar's triumph, we must also look beyond the cheering crowds and see the shadows cast by his legions. What was a glorious conquest for Rome was a catastrophe for the people of Gaul. We can't talk about Caesar's victory without acknowledging the immense human cost. Ancient historians, like Plutarch, estimate that in the course of his Gallic wars, 1 million people were killed and another million were enslaved. Think about that number. It's a staggering toll, a demographic disaster that wiped entire communities off the face of the earth. These weren't just abstract numbers. They were vibrant cultures, complex societies with their own laws, traditions, art, and religion. They were people with families, hopes, and dreams, all extinguished by the relentless advance of the Roman war machine. The story of Vercingetorix, the chieftain of the Arverni tribe, personifies this tragedy. He was a charismatic leader who managed to unite the fractious Gallic tribes against Caesar, a feat no one had thought possible. He was a brilliant strategist in his own right, employing scorched earth tactics to deny the Roman legions supplies. He represented the spirit of Gallic independence, the last, best hope for his people to remain free. After his surrender at Alesia, he was held in a Roman prison for 6 years, waiting. Waiting for what? To be the star attraction in Caesar's triumph. Imagine his final moments. paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, a living trophy for the man who had destroyed his world before being ritually executed. His fate is a brutal reminder that one man's triumph is another man's ultimate defeat and humiliation. The victory parade in Rome was a funeral procession for Gallic freedom. This brings us to the core dilemma of Caesar's legacy. We must confront the idea that the civilizing mission of Rome, the spread of Roman law, language, and infrastructure, the famous Pax Romana, was built upon a foundation of violence and cultural extinction. The Gauls, the Celts, the Germanic tribes, these were not barbarians. In the modern sense of the word, they had rich oral traditions, sophisticated metalworking, and deep spiritual beliefs. The Druids, for example, were not just priests. They were the judges, teachers, and intellectual class of Gallic society. Rome's conquest effectively erased much of this culture. Their sacred groves were cut down, their oral histories were lost, and their languages were slowly replaced by Latin. While aspects of their culture survived by merging with Roman customs, a unique and ancient world was irrevocably lost. We are left with only fragments, seen mostly through the eyes of their conquerors. Caesar's impact on Rome itself was just as revolutionary. Returning from Gaul not as a mere general but as a populist hero with a fiercely loyal veteran army, he shattered the old political order. By crossing the Rubicon River with his army in 49 BCE, he committed an act of treason against the state, famously declaring Alea Iacta Est the Dias Cast. This act plunged Rome into a series of devastating civil wars. He fought against Pompey the Great, his former ally, and the conservative senatorial faction known as the Optimates, who feared his ambition and power. His victories at Pharsalus, Thapsus, and Munda left him the undisputed master of Rome. He was made dictator in perpetuum, dictator for life. As dictator, Caesar initiated a flurry of reforms. He tackled debt, reformed the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar, the basis for our own, planned massive public works projects, and extended Roman citizenship to people in the provinces. Many of these reforms were practical, popular, and arguably necessary to manage the now sprawling Roman state. He seemed to be laying the groundwork for a new kind of government, one better suited to ruling an empire than the old city-state republic. He was efficient, decisive, and visionary. He brought order out of chaos. But in doing so, he destroyed the very system he claimed to serve. The Roman Republic, with its complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one man from gaining too much power, was dead. Caesar held all the power in his hands. He may not have called himself a king, but for all practical purposes, he was, and this, ultimately, led to his downfall. A group of senators, styling themselves the liberators, saw him not as a savior, but as a tyrant who had crushed Roman liberty. They believed that by killing him, they could restore the Republic. On the Ides of March, 44 Bessa, they surrounded him in the Senate and stabbed him to death. But their hopes were in vain. The Republic was too broken to be saved. Caesar's assassination didn't restore the old ways. It just unleashed another round of brutal civil wars. From this chaos, Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, would eventually emerge as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The paradox is that the men who killed Caesar to prevent a king inadvertently paved the way for an emperor. Caesar's true legacy wasn't just his conquests or his reforms. It was the fundamental transformation of Rome from a republic into an empire. He didn't wear the crown, but he forged it. So, how do we judge him? Was he a visionary hero who brought order and stability, or a power-hungry tyrant who destroyed a republic and countless lives for his own ambition? The truth, as it so often is complex and uncomfortable. He was both. He was a military genius and a ruthless conqueror. He was a brilliant politician and a man who dismantled the political system. He brought an end to the chaos of the late republic, but did so through civil war and dictatorship. His legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of glory and threads of blood. To admire his achievements without acknowledging the suffering they caused is to see only half the picture. To condemn his brutality without understanding the context of his time and the magnitude of his impact is to miss the point entirely. Caesar forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable idea that progress and destruction can be two sides of the same coin. His story is not just a chapter in a history book. It's a timeless lesson on power, ambition, and the enduring, often tragic, complexity of the human condition. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Caesar's legacy. It's a topic that deserves careful thought and reflection. If you found this discussion interesting, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter in history. Your support means the world and allows us to keep exploring these fascinating stories together. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into the final, and perhaps most fascinating, chapter of Vercingetorix's story. His incredible resurrection as a national hero. Century as a national hero. It's a tale of how a forgotten Gallic chieftain became the very symbol of French identity and resistance. So, how did this happen? Let's find out. For almost 2,000 years, Vercingetorix was largely a footnote in history, a name mentioned only in Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. After his execution in Rome, his memory faded. The Romans successfully integrated Gaul into their empire, and over time, the Gauls became Gallic. The language, culture, and tribal identities of pre-Roman Gaul were absorbed and transformed. The Franks, a Germanic tribe, later established the kingdom that would become France. For centuries, French monarchs and historians traced their origins back to the Franks, particularly to their first king, Clovis. The Gauls were seen as a distant, almost primitive past, not the true ancestors of the French people. Vercingetorix, the defeated leader of these people, was simply not part of the national story. He was a ghost, a name in an ancient Latin text, nothing more. But history has a funny way of resurrecting its heroes when they are needed most. The spark for Vercingetorix's revival came in the 19th century, a period of intense change and turmoil in France. The French Revolution had overturned the old monarchy, and the nation was struggling to define its new identity. Who were the French people? Where did they truly come from? This question became a battlefield for historians and politicians. A new school of thought began to challenge the traditional narrative that France's origins lay with the Germanic Franks. Historians like Alesia started to popularize the idea that the true soul of France was not Frankish, but Gallic. They argued that the Gauls were the indigenous people of the land, the real ancestors of the French population. This idea, known as nos ancêtres, les Gaulois, our ancestors, the Gauls, began to take root in the public imagination. It offered a unifying identity based on a shared, deep-rooted heritage that predated kings and aristocrats. In this new search for Gallic roots, Vercingetorix was the perfect hero waiting to be rediscovered. He was a unifier who brought disparate Gallic tribes together. He was a freedom fighter who stood up against a powerful foreign invader. His struggle, though ultimately unsuccessful, was filled with courage, intelligence, and a fierce love for his land and people. He wasn't a king ruling by divine right, but a charismatic leader chosen by his peers. This image resonated powerfully with the new Republican and nationalist ideals of 19th century France. He represented the spirit of the people rising up to defend their liberty. His story was a powerful counter-narrative to the tales of kings and emperors. It was a story of the soil, of the common people, and of a fight for freedom against overwhelming odds. Suddenly, the defeated chieftain was no longer a symbol of failure, but a glorious martyr for a noble cause. The man who truly cemented Vercingetorix's place in the national pantheon was none other than Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the last monarch of France. This might seem strange. Why would an emperor want to celebrate a hero who fought against an imperial power? Well, Napoleon III was a complex figure. He was deeply fascinated by Roman history and, particularly, by Julius Caesar. He even wrote a multi-volume history of Caesar's life. While researching this book, he naturally delved deep into the Gallic Wars and the story of Caesar's greatest adversary. But Napoleon III was also a savvy politician. He needed to unite a divided France and create a strong national identity to legitimize his own rule. He saw in Vercingetorix a figure that could appeal to everyone. For Republicans, he was a symbol of popular resistance. For nationalists, he was the first great French patriot. By celebrating both Caesar, the great conqueror and civilizer, and Vercingetorix, the heroic defender of Gaul, Napoleon III could cleverly position himself as the heir to all of France's glorious history. To bring this vision to life, Napoleon III commissioned a series of grand projects. The most famous of these is the monumental statue of Vercingetorix, erected in 1865 at Alesia. The site officially identified by Napoleon's archaeologists as the location of the final siege of Alesia. The statue, designed by the sculptor A. Millet, is over 7 meters tall and stands on a massive 20-meter-high pedestal. It is an incredibly romanticized and powerful image. Vercingetorix is depicted with long, flowing hair and a magnificent mustache, looking down with a somber, defiant expression. This look, by the way, was based more on 19th-century romantic ideas of noble savages than on actual historical evidence of how Gallic warriors appeared, but it was incredibly effective. The inscription on the pedestal, written by Napoleon III himself, reads, "Gaul united, forming a single nation, animated by a common spirit, can defy the universe." This powerful message transformed a military defeat into a moral victory, a foundational moment for French national unity. This statue wasn't a standalone project. Napoleon III's government actively promoted the story of Vercingetorix. His image began to appear everywhere, in textbooks, paintings, and popular literature. School children across France learned about their brave Gallic ancestor who fought valiantly against the Roman legions. He became a household name, a figure as well known as Joan of Arc or Napoleon Bonaparte. This process of myth-making was incredibly successful. It created a shared story that all French citizens could feel a part of. Regardless of their political leanings or social class, Vercingetorix became the archetypal French hero. Brave, a bit rebellious, fiercely independent, and willing to sacrifice everything for the love of his homeland, or la patrie. The legend of Vercingetorix proved to be incredibly durable. It continued to be a potent symbol throughout the tumultuous events of the 20th century. During the Franco-Prussian War, and especially during World War I, Vercingetorix was invoked as a symbol of resistance against German invasion. Propaganda posters depicted him inspiring modern French soldiers. He represented the eternal spirit of a nation that would never surrender its freedom. Later, during World War II, his name was once again invoked by the French resistance. The fight against the Roman invaders was equated with the fight against the Nazi occupation. Vercingetorix was the original resistant, a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming force, the spirit of liberty could not be extinguished. His legacy provided comfort and inspiration during France's darkest hours. Even today, Vercingetorix remains a powerful and recognizable figure in French culture. While historians now have a more nuanced and less romanticized view of him in the Gallic Wars, his symbolic status is undeniable. He appears in everything from comic books, like the famous Asterix series, which playfully riffs on the theme of Gallic resistance, to movies and political cartoons. The site of Alesia is now a major museum and interpretive center, the Museo, which explores the historical reality of the siege. Politicians still occasionally reference him in speeches to evoke themes of national pride and sovereignty. He has become a flexible symbol, a historical figure onto whom generations of French people have projected their hopes, fears, and ideals. So, from a defeated tribal leader executed in a Roman prison to a national icon immortalized in bronze, Vercingetorix's journey through history is truly extraordinary. His story is a powerful testament to how the past is constantly reinterpreted and given new meaning in the present. He wasn't just a man who fought and lost a war 2,000 years ago. He became a legend, an idea, a symbol of the enduring spirit of a nation. His true victory was not on the battlefield of Alesia, but in the hearts and minds of the French people, centuries after his death. The legend, it seems, truly does live on. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the life and legacy of Vercingetorix. I hope you enjoyed this series as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Your support means the world to us. Let me know in the comments what historical figure you'd like to explore next. Until then, stay curious. As our journey through the annals of history comes to a close, we find ourselves standing at the edge of time, looking back not at a vanquished people, but at a spirit that was never truly conquered. The story of Gaul isn't just a tale of chieftains and legions, of druids and OP. It's the story of a beginning, an origin point for an idea that would ripple through the centuries. Think of it. The fierce, unyielding desire for freedom that drove Vercingetorix to unite disparate tribes against the mightiest empire on earth. Does that fire not burn in the heart of the French spirit today? When we speak of liberty, equality, and fraternity, we are, in many ways, speaking a language whose first dialect was Gallic. It's a legacy not written in crumbling stone, but in the very character of a nation. The Romans gave France its language, its laws, and its roads. But the Gauls, they gave France its soul. This deep, almost stubborn connection to the land. This profound sense of belonging to a specific place. Terroir. Asterisk is a direct inheritance. It's in the wine grower, tending his ancestral vines. The baker pulling bread from an oven whose design has barely changed. The fierce pride in regional identity that coexists with a powerful national unity. This unity, forged in the crucible of resistance, is perhaps the most enduring echo. The Gauls were a patchwork of tribes, often at odds with one another. Yet, when faced with a common threat, they found a strength and togetherness that almost defied the odds. This capacity to unify, to stand as one people, asterisk on pupil asterisk, is a recurring theme in French history. It's the spirit of the resistance, the spirit of the revolution, the spirit that rises time and again to defend its identity. And what of courage? It wasn't just the courage of the warrior on the battlefield, brandishing his longsword. It was the courage to be different, to maintain a unique culture against overwhelming pressure. It was the courage of the druids, keepers of ancient wisdom, who passed down their knowledge through generations, not on scrolls, but in the living memory of their people. This intellectual and cultural bravery, this insistence on a unique way of seeing the world, remains a hallmark of French thought and art. Today, if you walk through the ancient forests of Brocéliande, or stand atop a hill in the Auvergne watching the mist curl through the valleys, you can feel it. It's a quiet presence, a resonance in the very soil. It's the whisper of a past that never truly left. The names have changed, the empires have risen and fallen, but the fundamental spirit, that blend of fierce independence, passionate unity, and indomitable courage. This is the echo of Gaul. It is not a ghost haunting the landscape, but a living, breathing part of modern France. It's in the spirited debates, in Parisian cafes, in the unwavering solidarity shown in times of crisis, and in the quiet pride of a nation that knows its roots run deep, far deeper than the Roman flagstones, down into the very heart of the Gallic earth. Look out at those misty hills, at the silent watching trees. Listen. In the quiet, you can almost hear it, the enduring heartbeat of Gaul, a rhythm that still guides the soul of France. The chapter may be closed, but the story is written on the land and in the people forever. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. If you've enjoyed exploring the depths of history with us, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us continue to bring these stories to life. Until next time, stay curious.